Hey friends. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the strange, ambitious, and yet often eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards. A world where the ideal wasn't to look vibrant or healthy, but rather like someone who had just been gracefully excerpt. Before we get too deep, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the kind of weird, haunting history we explore here. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your clock. It's always eerie and amazing to see who's wandering these halls of history with me from across the world now. Dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft, dreamlike hum in the background. And let's drift into tonight's tale together. It begins not with a brushstroke of paint or a glance in the mirror, but with silence. The kind of heavy, echoing silence that lived inside stone walls and beneath candlelit ceilings. In the medieval world, beauty was not an accessory. It was not optional. It was a whisper in the corridor of survival, a subtle but deeply woven part of one's fate. It decided marriages, alliances, reputations, and in some cases, it determined whether a person would be remembered at all. But what did it mean to be beautiful in a time when there were no selfies, no Hollywood, and no fluorescent-lit department store mirrors? The answer is far stranger than most imagine. To begin this journey, we must first understand that medieval beauty wasn't universal. It shifted with time, with class, and with geography. A noblewoman in the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine in 12th century France would be judged by vastly different standards than a peasant girl working in the fields of Saxony. A Byzantine empress's appearance might reflect spiritual power, while an Irish poet's muse was praised in verses for her ghostly pallor and hair like spun gold under moonlight. But regardless of these regional differences, one thing remained constant: beauty was rarely about health or natural charm. It was about symbolism, status, and control. In much of Western Europe, particularly among the nobility, a woman was considered most beautiful when her appearance suggested fragility, silence, and spiritual purity. Pale skin was prized, not just because it was rare among the sun-drenched working classes, but because it symbolized leisure, delicacy, and a life untouched by manual labor. A flawless milk-white face was ideal, but not too white, for fear it might appear ghostly or unclean. Rouge was often used sparingly, made from crushed berries or roots, to add just enough life to the cheeks to imply innocence and youth without appearing too robust. Eyebrows, as strange as it sounds to us now, were the enemy of elegance in many circles. Women in noble courts would often pluck them entirely, or shave them back so far that their foreheads looked unnaturally large. This was because a high forehead was seen as a sign of intelligence and noble breeding. Hairlines were manipulated through painful means. Some even used hot cloths or small razors to push back the hairline inch by inch, all in service to this ideal. The goal was not to look seductive but ethereal, untouchable, like a living statue, carved by a holy hand. Hair was another key battlefield in the war of medieval beauty. Long, flowing hair, especially blonde, was considered the height of female desirability in much of Western Europe, but again, there were contradictions. A woman's hair was seen as both her greatest beauty and her greatest sin. It was to be admired, but only in the private sphere. A married woman revealing her hair in public could be considered indecent. Wives and widows wore veils or wimples that covered the hair entirely. Young, unmarried women were often allowed to leave it uncovered on feast days or special occasions. But the tension between admiration and modesty never quite relaxed in the early Middle Ages. Beauty was often associated with religious virtue. Saints were described as physically radiant, glowing with divine light. Their physical appearances were idealized in art splendor, elongated figures with serene expressions and modest postures. To be beautiful was to be holy, and to be holy was to be beautiful. But this also came with danger. Women who were considered too beautiful, too alluring, were often treated with suspicion. They were seen as temptresses, as portals through which sin might enter the world. Many medieval tales feature female characters whose beauty is both their blessing and their doom. Think of Guinevere, Isolde, or even Eve in her post-paradise form. Their beauty invites adoration, but also chaos. The standards imposed on men, while less talked about, were just as rigid in their own way. Noblemen were expected to be tall, strong, and fair-skinned, but not sunburned. They needed to appear as if born for battle, but not as if they actually spent time in the mud. A fine nose, clear skin, straight teeth, and soft hands were praised. Muscles were acceptable, but a rugged, scarred body was more often associated with mercenaries than with nobility. And just as with women, the line between divine handsomeness and dangerous vanity was thin. A man who paid too much attention to his appearance was often ridiculed, considered effeminate or sinful. He could be admired in poetry but mocked in the tavern. Makeup, as a concept, was complicated. It certainly existed. Women whitened their faces with lead-based powders, reddened their cheeks with natural dyes, darkened their lashes with soot. But to be caught wearing too much or being too obvious about it risked being labeled as deceitful, even demonic. There was a belief that altering one's God-given appearance was a kind of spiritual rebellion, and yet many women took that risk, quietly applying mixtures behind closed doors, whispering beauty secrets through generations. The medieval ideal extended beyond just the face and body. Smell mattered. Cleanliness, while difficult in an era without modern plumbing, was pursued with a kind of religious devotion. Herbs were crushed into oils to mask odors. Lavender, rosemary, and sage were popular among the upper classes, who would tuck sachets of them into their clothing. Bathing was encouraged in some regions and condemned in others, depending on the prevailing interpretation of religious texts. But to smell pleasant, or at least not offensive, was part of the beauty standard, especially at court. Posture, too, played a role. A beautiful woman walked slowly, gracefully, never hurried. She kept her eyes lowered, not just out of modesty but to protect the delicacy of her gaze. A man of beauty and status walked upright, but never aggressively. He commanded attention with ease, not force. Every gesture, every movement, every tilt of the head could either elevate or ruin one's appearance. As time moved forward and cultures began to collide through war, trade, and pilgrimage, the concept of beauty began to evolve. The Crusades brought back not just relics and silk, but new ideals. Exposure to Eastern art and literature began to shift European aesthetics. Suddenly, darker features became exotic and desirable. Intricate clothing, jewelry, and perfumes from the Arab world began to influence European fashion. But these shifts did not erase the core medieval belief that beauty was tied to morality, status, and fate. Artists, poets, and chroniclers played their part in reinforcing these ideals. Paintings depicted the Virgin Mary not as a Middle Eastern woman but as a pale, blue-eyed figure, reflecting not truth but European beauty ideals. Troubadours sang songs praising women with skin like cream, eyes like sapphires, and lips like rose petals. These descriptions were not just flattery, they became standards by which real women were judged. And all of this, the plucked brows, the veiled hair, the rouged-stained cheeks, served a deeper social function. In a world where most people were born and died in the same village, where social mobility was rare, beauty became a form of currency. A beautiful daughter could secure a better marriage. A handsome boy might earn the favor of a lord. And yet, those same traits could bring danger, envy, accusation, in a society where witches were burned and sins were punished harshly. To stand out too brightly was a risk. As we continue through this strange candlelit world, we'll uncover even stranger truths, how medieval people used animal fat and lead to maintain appearances. How entire poems were written about the curve of a woman's wrist, and how some beauty rituals bordered on the grotesque. But for now, know this: in the Middle Ages, beauty was never just skin deep. It was a signal, a weapon, a prayer, and sometimes a curse. In the flickering shadows of the medieval night, while the common folk rested their weary limbs and the noble houses drew shut their heavy velvet drapes, a quieter drama unfolded in the minds of many, the pursuit of beauty not for art's sake, but survival's. In an era ruled not by the lens of a camera, but by the judgmental gaze of society, beauty was never merely decoration. It was duty. It was expectation. And in some tragic cases, it was a sentence. Consider the marriage market, perhaps the most visible stage upon which medieval beauty was both showcased and scrutinized. A noble daughter, for instance, was not raised with thoughts of romantic love or personal ambition. Her body was a vessel of lineage, her face a reflection of her family's honor, and her appearance a bargaining chip in alliances sealed not with kisses but with parchment and wax. And so, the process of grooming a young girl into a symbol of marital desirability began early, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, long before her body or voice had matured. Long before she had formed opinions of her own. In the grand halls of medieval courts, beauty was like armor, silent but powerful. A girl with the right complexion, the right proportions, and the right lineage could be betrothed before she had even learned to write her name. Her parents would measure her worth in dowries and land rights, but the suitor's eyes would fall first on her visible traits. And those traits, it must be noted, were not always based on natural standards, but on ideals inherited from classical texts, religious dogma, and cultural imagination. The influence of ancient Roman and Greek aesthetics lingered like perfume over much of medieval Europe. Though distorted through time and reinterpretation, the admiration for symmetrical features, proportionate limbs, and serene expressions persisted. Monastic scribes, copying ancient texts, described the feminine ideal as one with small, dainty feet, long and slender fingers, a narrow waist, and hips broad enough to suggest fertility, but not so wide as to suggest lustfulness. Everything was about balance, enough beauty to command attention, not enough to incite scandal. The same codes applied to courtly love that highly ritualized, emotionally perilous system of romance that shaped much of medieval literature and behavior. In this tradition, a knight might dedicate his loyalty and service to a lady of noble birth, not his wife, often, but a woman unattainable by design. He would praise her from afar, comparing her to angels and stars, writing verses about her almond eyes or swan-like neck. These descriptions, though poetic, laid the groundwork for real-world expectations. A lady who did not fit these ideals was considered less worthy of devotion, her value as a muse diminished by physical imperfection. Yet even those imperfections could become currency in the right setting. A small mole near the mouth could be called a beauty mark, a term born from these medieval aesthetics. Freckles, normally frowned upon, might be overlooked if the lady possessed otherwise graceful features. But a hooked nose, a square jaw, or a sun-darkened complexion, these could seal a woman's fate, pushing her to the social periphery, or forcing her into the convent, where her beauty or lack thereof no longer mattered. Men, too, were not immune to these rules. Though less objectified, they were certainly observed. A nobleman with a crooked back or limp wrist might be ridiculed behind closed doors, or worse, deemed cursed. Chivalric literature praised knights with golden curls, chiseled faces, and bodies molded for war. In a society obsessed with the alignment of the physical and moral, physical beauty was assumed to mirror inner virtue. To look noble was to be noble, or at least to be treated as such. But this relationship between appearance and character could also turn deadly. In many parts of Europe, particularly during the later Middle Ages, the fear of witchcraft and heresy became intertwined with suspicion of physical anomalies. Women who were too beautiful were sometimes seen as dangerous enchantresses, their charms a sign of the devil's handiwork. Conversely, those who were deformed or aged were often accused of witchcraft outright. Beauty became a narrow path flanked on either side by suspicion and ruin. One of the more fascinating and haunting aspects of medieval beauty standards was the connection between physical appearance and religious virtue. The Church played a central role in dictating these ideals, directly and indirectly. Religious art depicted saints and angels as fair, delicate, and luminous. These representations influenced not just how people saw holiness, but how they saw themselves. A woman with pale skin and a soft, solemn gaze could be described as Mary-like. A man with a strong chin and upright posture might be compared to St. George. These weren't compliments, they were aspirations, but the Church also warned against vanity. Sermons railed against those who spent too much time in front of polished copper mirrors, who adorned themselves with jewelry, who wore rich silks and scented oils. Yet at the same time, monks and friars recorded tales of women whose spiritual purity made them glow with inner light, their faces untouched by age, even after years of fasting and penance. The contradiction was cruel. Be beautiful, but not because you tried to be. Be graceful, but never aware of your grace. This paradox plagued many, particularly women, who found themselves navigating a world where every hairpin choice could bring admiration or condemnation. Let us pause and step inside the chamber of a noblewoman, preparing for a feast day in a 14th century English manor. The shutters are closed to the cold. A small fire hisses in the corner. She sits before a burnished metal mirror, her maid combing her hair gently, slowly, for to tug too hard is to offend both the mistress and the standard of calm composure. She applies a thin layer of powder made from ground oyster shells to her face. It brightens her skin, but also carries with it the risk of infection. Her cheeks are touched with crushed raspberries. Her eyes are darkened with burnt cork ash. There is no vanity here, only necessity. She must appear soft but noble, holy but alluring. A mother to be, a keeper of the house, a prize. This ritual takes hours. She will be seen for mere minutes. Now leave that room and walk to the edge of the village, where a farmer's daughter carries buckets of water from the well. Her dress is coarse, her skin browned by sun and wind. Her hair is braided not for style but for function. Yet even here, beauty plays its part. Perhaps she is praised for her strong limbs, her sturdy hips, her bright teeth. These are different standards, born of different needs. A healthy woman here is not one who resembles a painting, but one who can carry, birth, work, and endure. Her beauty is not framed in poetry, but in function. This division between noble and common standards of beauty reveals a deeper truth about the medieval world, that beauty was always political. It reinforced class. It upheld hierarchy. It whispered who belonged and who did not. It decided whose portraits were painted in manuscript margins, whose names lived in songs, and whose faces disappeared in time. Cosmetics, when available, were a form of resistance as much as conformity. Recipes for skin creams and perfumes circulated in hidden corners. Some included honey, rosewater, or animal fats. Others were more dangerous, containing mercury, lead, or crushed glass. Women risked their health to appear closer to the ideal, even as physicians and priests warned against such indulgence. And yet, the desire to be seen, to be desired, to be chosen, proved stronger than the caution. Hair dye, too, became an underground art, while blonde hair was widely favored in much of Europe, seen as a symbol of youth, divinity, and nobility. Not everyone was born with it. And so, elaborate treatments were invented. Saffron mixed with alum, chamomile boiled into pastes, vinegar rinses under hours of sun. Some methods burned the scalp, others did little but stain the pillows. But even failure did not stop the effort. The male version of this pursuit was less about enhancement and more about suppression. Men did not whiten their faces or rouge their cheeks, but they did worry about signs of aging, of illness, of frailty. A balding head might be covered with a hood or cap. Rotten teeth, common in both genders due to diet, were masked with herbs or avoided through carefully crafted smiles. And although armor and clothing often hid the body, the way a man moved, how he stood, how he rode, how he danced spoke volumes. Poise was a form of appearance, and appearance, again, was destiny. As we draw this part of the journey to a close, it becomes clear that beauty in the medieval world was not a luxury, nor merely a cultural quirk. It was a deeply entrenched, often contradictory, force shaped by religion, class, geography, fear, desire, and myth. A woman might be praised for her eyes but punished for their boldness. A man might be admired for his stature but cast aside for his limp. Beauty was a veil through which power moved, often silently, always watching, and as we move forward, through the brocade curtains of Renaissance courts, across the silk routes of trade, and into the private diaries of those who lived behind the heavy stone walls, we will find that the strangest standards have yet to come. The morning air over the medieval countryside was often damp, heavy with the scent of earth, livestock, and wood smoke. As the sun rose behind distant hills, peasants began their labors, and noble courtiers stirred within stone keeps, each tethered in some way to the invisible chains of beauty. It was not simply a matter of decoration or preference, it was a system, a worldview. And the closer we look, the more we realize that this system was riddled with contradictions, bound to spiritual beliefs, and laced with quiet cruelty. Let us now peer into the curious relationship between beauty and suffering. It may be tempting to assume that medieval beauty rituals were whimsical or superficial, a brush of powder, a twist of braid, a veil placed just so. But more often than not, these rituals were exhausting and even dangerous. To appear effortlessly beautiful often required intense effort and genuine pain. In the pages of medieval medical treatises and household recipe books, we find methods that would be unthinkable today. Skin lightening creams made with mercury, elixirs promising youth that included urine or ox bile, cures for freckles or blemishes that involve lye, vinegar, and crushed chalk. Women were advised to bathe in milk or apply poultices of barley, egg whites, or even leeches to their faces. The idea was not to enhance health but to correct what was seen as a divine imperfection. The horror of this becomes more striking when viewed against the backdrop of religion. Beauty in the medieval age was bound tightly to the soul. Many believed that physical appearance reflected one's virtue or sin. A beautiful woman was assumed to have been favored by God, while those with deformities, scars, or unusual features were sometimes seen as cursed. This ideology wasn't limited to folklore. It found its way into sermons, laws, and even court proceedings. Inquisitors questioned women accused of witchcraft not only about their beliefs but also about their appearances. Did they have moles, birthmarks, or blemishes in hidden places? These marks were sometimes referred to as devil's teats, signs of secret pacts with dark forces. And thus, the female body became a battleground not only for beauty but for survival itself. We must not imagine that these standards were static. Over the course of centuries, they shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, as trade routes opened and cultural exchange flourished. Especially in the later medieval period, new ideas of beauty began to arrive from the East. The influence of Moorish Spain, for instance, introduced different color palettes, fabrics, perfumes, and even facial features into the European aesthetic imagination. Arab poetry praised women with darker eyes and deeper complexions. Persian fashion emphasized long black hair, wide eyes, and henna-tinted fingertips. These visions entered European culture through art, travel, war, and diplomacy, both fascination and fear. And yet, these new standards often clashed with the prevailing Christian ideals of modesty and restraint. The Church viewed the body as a vessel of temptation, a tool that the devil could use to seduce the righteous. Therefore, beauty had to be controlled, hidden, or redefined. Even saints were depicted with unnaturally modest expressions, their faces drained of sensuality, as if to strip them of human weakness. One can observe this paradox in the stained glass windows of cathedrals and the illuminated manuscripts produced in monasteries. There is elegance, yes, but it is distant, cold, a vision of beauty that hovers just out of reach. And what of aging? In the medieval world, youth was not just preferred, it was worshipped. A young woman was considered in her prime for marriage. By age 12 or 13, often wed before her body had fully matured. With youth came fertility, and with fertility came value. But as the years passed, and wrinkles or gray hairs began to appear, a woman's desirability waned rapidly. Remedies for signs of aging were common, but rarely effective. Dried rose petals soaked in wine, or pastes made from sheep fat, were said to restore softness to aging skin. But the results were fleeting, and the underlying message was clear. To grow old was to grow invisible. Men, of course, aged differently in the eyes of society. An older man could still be considered handsome, even wisest, especially if he possessed wealth or influence. A gray beard might denote wisdom, a weathered face, experience. But there were limits. A man who grew too frail, too hunched, or too pale was often dismissed or pitied. Knights who could no longer ride, or noblemen who lost their teeth, were no longer seen as powerful, and so they too turned to remedies, elixirs made of honey and herbs, concoctions promising strength, virility, or eternal youth. These efforts rarely succeeded, but the desire to conform to youthful ideals persisted regardless. Now imagine the private thoughts of a young girl, perhaps the daughter of a lesser nobleman, being sent to court as a lady-in-waiting. She has heard the stories that her worth will be weighed by the curve of her cheekbones, the shine of her hair, the poise of her ankles when she kneels. Her mother warns her not to speak too loudly, not to laugh too freely, not to run or sweat or tan in the sun. Her nurse gently scrapes her skin with lemon peel to lighten it. Her maid scolds her for chewing too much bread, warning it will round her face. At night, she stares into the polished brass of her hand mirror, wondering if her nose is too wide, if her lips are too thin. She says her prayers, asking not only for grace, but for beauty. Because beauty, she has been taught, will keep her safe. And what of the women who defied these rules? They existed often at the fringes. Wise women, healers, midwives. Some were unmarried, others widowed. They wore no rouge, covered their hair in wool, spoke their minds too freely. Their beauty was in their defiance, though few would say so openly. They were admired quietly, from behind veils or across pews, and sometimes they were punished, whispered about, blamed when crops failed or fevers spread. Their lack of conformity made them dangerous. The role of clothing in medieval beauty cannot be overstated. Fashion was a visual languagea way of stating one's identity, wealth, and status. Silhouettes changed across the centuries, but certain rules remained. Narrow waists, long trains, sleeves that draped like banners. For women, bodices were often tight, not to emphasize the bust, but to elongate the torso. Stomachers flattened the front of the body, creating the illusion of an ethereal form more statue than flesh. Men wore doublets, hose, and often padded or tailored to give the appearance of broad shoulders and slim waists. Armor was as much about image as it was about protection. Even in war, beauty played its part, color mattered. In the medieval imagination, colors were not just hues, they were symbols. Blue was purity, white was chastity, red was passion or danger. A woman wearing green might be thought of as fertile or fickle. A man dressed in black might be powerful or secretive. Gold was divinity, silver sorrow. The fabrics themselves were clues: silk for the rich, wool for the poor, linen for the modest. But beauty could also be found in contrast. A nobleman might wear a simple brown robe to signal humility. A nun might tuck a single flower into her belt on feast days, a whisper of beauty beneath the vows. As we examine the pages of medieval poetry and song, we see these ideas of beauty immortalized again and again. Troubadours in southern France sang of La Belle Dame sans mercy, the beautiful lady without mercy, whose eyes could kill more swiftly than a sword. In Icelandic sagas, fair-haired warriors were likened to shining gods. In Arabic Andalusian verse, beauty was compared to the garden lush, dark, and perfumed. These descriptions were not mere flattery. They shaped what people looked for, what they feared, what they punished. Yet even in these songs, there are cracks in the mirror. Poets often describe the sorrow of beauty, the pain of desire, the cruelty of unattainable perfection. They speak of women who weep behind veils, men who crumble at the sight of a bare wrist. Beauty, in these tales, is both dream and torment. And perhaps that is the most honest reflection of how it operated in medieval life. It was never simple, never pure, and so we are left with a world haunted by its own ideals. A world where a girl might pluck her brows until her skin bled, where a man might die in battle trying to appear fearless and strong. A world where beauty could be a blessing, a curse, a prison, or a disguise. And yet they pursued it across kingdoms and cathedrals, through markets and monasteries, in secret and in spectacle. The journey is far from over. We have not yet spoken of the hidden rituals passed down in convents, or the erotic politics of court masks, or the way plague and famine reshaped what it meant to look alive, let alone beautiful. We have yet to unearth the mirrors buried in forgotten dowries, or the poetry etched onto parchment in trembling hands. But that is for another night. In the depths of the medieval psyche, beauty remained a ghost that drifted through all layers of life, from royal courts and candlelit cathedrals to village squares and famine-ridden farmsteads. Its shape was fluid, its meaning mutable, but its power was constant. It shaped not just how people saw others, but how they saw themselves. And as this force took root in the cultural soil of Europe, it began to branch into stranger and darker territories where superstition, survival, and spectacle collided. Consider now the role of illness in shaping perceptions of beauty in a world before modern medicine, where plagues came like judgment and fevers arrived with little warning. The human body was an anxious canvas. Pale skin, which we've already seen held high status among the nobility, was not just a symbol of delicacy, was also an assurance of health, or rather the appearance of it. Rosy cheeks might suggest a healthy circulation or the onset of disease. A sudden flush could mean attraction, but it could just as easily signal a brewing infection. In these blurred lines, beauty and fear became indistinguishable. In the late 14th century, when the Black Death swept across Europe like a scythe through wheat, the understanding of beauty underwent a shift. Bodies became sites of terror. Swollen lymph nodes, blotched skin, bloodshot eyes, all once neutral features suddenly became harbingers of death. people began to look at one another differently. Suspicion colored every glance. To appear sick was to be feared. To appear too healthy, too vibrant, almost became a threatened arrogance in the face of divine punishment. Thus, beauty became subdued. Austerity returned. Modesty reigned. But not everywhere, and not always. In the wealthier circles, those untouched by the worst of the plague or determined to pretend as much, fashion and appearance became an act of resistance against decay. During the years that followed the plague, some nobles dressed more extravagantly than ever. Bright fabrics, rare dyes, luxurious furs were worn with a defiant flourish, as if beauty itself could ward off death. This theatricality crept into makeup as well. Lead-based powders were applied more liberally, even though they made the skin appear unnaturally pale and could cause long-term damage. It did not matter. Looking fragile, even sickly, became oddly desirable, so long as the person did not actually die. The idea of beauty as a performance became more explicit in this period. Enter the mask, the elaborate court entertainment that blended music, theater, dance, and costume. Though more often associated with the Renaissance, its roots were deeply medieval. These masks were more than parties. They were displays of social order, allegory, and fantasy, where the beautiful could show themselves not just as desirable, but as mythic. Women might appear dressed as goddesses, their hair powdered and threaded with pearls. Men came as knights, saints, or spirits. Every movement was calculated, every expression rehearsed. In these masks, beauty was both armor and seduction, mask within a mask, and outside the court, in the dusty lanes of towns, in markets that reeked of fish and iron, beauty meant something different. A woman selling herbs might tuck wildflowers into her hair, not because she sought attention, but because it reminded her of her youth. A man with missing teeth might still be considered handsome if he had a straight back and a confident stride. In poorer areas, the labor-worn body became its own kind of beauty, a testament to endurance, to contribution, to worth. Still, even among the commoners, ideals persisted. Folk remedies for enhancing appearance were passed down through generations. Boiled nettle to clear the skin, egg yolk masks for a smooth complexion, crushed lavender to perfume the hair. Simpler than court recipes, yes, but born of the same desire, to be seen, to be remembered, to belong. And so we begin to see a thread that runs through every class, every gender, every generation. The human need for beauty is rarely about vanity alone. It is about connection, identity, hope. As the century wore on, other forces began shaping the visual expectations of the time. The spread of Christianity had already set firm parameters for what was acceptable and what was sinful. But with the advent of new heresies, the rise of mysticism, and the increasing power of the Inquisition, the stakes grew higher. Beauty could not only invite admiration, could invite accusation. Imagine the face of a woman who has been named, in a whisper campaign, too lovely to be innocent, they say. Her hair is too thick, her smile too assured. A man once wrote her a poem, and he fell ill the next week. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. The woman's house is searched. Her herbs are confiscated. A midwife she once studied under disappears. A birthmark on her shoulder becomes evidence. Beauty, once her asset, becomes her trap. But not all traps were so overt. Most were quiet, almost gentle. They arrived in the form of books. The Trotula, a 12th century medical text attributed to a female physician, became popular in aristocratic households. It offered recipes for skincare, hair dye, and tooth whitening, but it also offered a framework for how a woman ought to think about her body as something to be tended, adjusted, curated. In these instructions, one sees the early stirrings of something modern, the idea that the body is a project, and where bodies became projects, mirrors became tools of obsession. Though rare and expensive, mirrors were treasured by those who could afford them. Polished metal, eventually glass backed with silver, allowed one to see their own reflection with increasing clarity. But clarity did not always bring peace. The mirror told the truth, but not gently. It showed the sagging skin, the wayward strand of hair, the freckle that had not been there the year before. Women wrote poems to their mirrors, some filled with devotion, others with sorrow. "You are my judge," one anonymous lady wrote in the margin of her prayer book beside a drawing of a mirror. "You know my vanity better than God." And so beauty became private, hidden in rituals performed alone. A brush pulled through hair, exactly 100 times before bed. A whispered prayer before applying a salve. A moment of reflection, not for the sake of pride, but of control. Because to be beautiful in the medieval world was not just to be admired. It was to be useful. A well-married daughter, a desired wife, a cherished mistress, a queen who bore sons. Every aspect of beauty was political. Let us also not forget the influence of the East, not just through war, but through commerce. From the 11th century onward, trade routes opened channels of exchange that brought perfumes, cosmetics, and fabrics into Europe from Persia, India, and the Arab world. With them came new ideals. Kohl, used to line the eyes, became popular in certain courts. Rosewater became a staple. Saffron, turmeric, and sandalwood were used in balms and masks. Some Christians viewed these luxuries with suspicion, seeing them as temptations from foreign lands. Others embraced them, desperate to mimic the mysterious elegance described in the tales of travelers like Marco Polo. This blend of admiration and fear mirrored the cultural anxiety of the age. The medieval mind often saw the exotic as both wondrous and corrupting. A woman who wore perfume from Damascus might be praised for her sophistication or accused of moral weakness. And so once again, beauty was not about choice. It was about balance, about reading the room, about surviving the gaze. The gaze, after all, was not passive. In many ways, it was the most powerful force of all. A woman might not even speak a word at court, but her appearance could speak volumes, drawing attention, jealousy, or strategic opportunity. For men, too, the gaze determined alliances. A nobleman's clothing, posture, and grooming signaled his value long before he spoke. And so both genders learned to perform, to adapt, to bend toward the ideal without ever daring to fully reach it. By now, you begin to see it. Beauty in the medieval world was not one thing. It was many. It was virtue. It was power. It was suspicion, poetry, punishment. It lived in the ivory tower and the marketplace, the monastery and the brothel. It was cultivated in silence, displayed in grandeur, and sometimes destroyed for being too loud. And yet, despite all this, people did not stop seeking it. They traced their fingers over prayer beads with smooth nails and hoped their hands looked soft enough. They stitched their dresses to fit a little tighter. They chewed fennel for fresh breath before meeting a stranger. They cut their hair when it grew uneven. They noticed the way the candlelight hit their cheeks in the bath. They worried, they longed, they changed. Just like we do now. But what separates then from now is not the desire, it is the danger. In the medieval world, to be beautiful was not merely to be admired. It was to be measured, to be watched, to be caught between reverence and suspicion. In the centuries to come, those consequences would deepen. In the cold breath of the early morning, beneath the thick tapestries and candlelit chambers of stone keeps, the first signs of life stir slowly. A lady-in-waiting rises before her mistress, preparing the tools of beauty like a priest arranging relics at the altar. A comb of bone, a pot of rose paste, a cloth soaked in milk and honey. This was no idle luxury. In the medieval world, appearance was performance, and every performance had stakes, even behind closed doors, even in the privacy of one's own chambers. Beauty was not a whisper, it was a negotiation, with fate, with faith, with power to understand how deeply these standards penetrated the medieval experience. We must go further still, not just into the rituals and expectations of individuals, but into the public systems that governed appearance. Laws, for instance, did not only protect property and life, they governed fabric, color, jewelry, and style. These were the sumptuary laws, legal mandates that regulated what people could and could not wear based on their social class, gender, and position. Sumptuary laws were not unique to one kingdom. England, France, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire all had their own variations, often updated century by century. They dictated the length of a train on a dress, the width of a sleeve, the number of fur linings one could possess. A merchant's wife might not wear pearls. A farmer could not wear velvet. Certain colors, especially deep blues and imperial purples, were reserved for nobility alone. These laws were justified as a way to preserve social order, to prevent extravagance, and to reinforce the visible markers of class. But they also had a darker function. They controlled beauty. A poor woman, no matter how fair her features or graceful her walk, could never be beautiful in the way society would acknowledge. Her clothing betrayed her. Her scent betrayed her. Her hands bore the calluses of labor. And thus, her beauty was rendered invisible by decree. On the rare occasion she did rise in the social world, perhaps through marriage, or the favor of a lord, she would be scrutinized not just for her actions, but for how she adorned herself. If she reached too high, if she dressed too richly, if her face showed too much artifice, she might be fined. Or worse, she might be mocked, suspected, even hated. Because beauty in the wrong hands was seen not as grace, but as threat. This tension became especially evident in the lives of courtesans and mistresses, women who existed both inside and outside the accepted social order, while the church and noble houses condemned extramarital affairs and promiscuity. Powerful men rarely restrained themselves. Kings took mistresses. Dukes kept women in secret apartments. These women were often chosen for their beauty, sometimes their wit, but rarely their birth. And yet, the same qualities that elevated them in private cast them in shadow in public to survive. These women became masters of appearance. They wore cosmetics more daringly. They manipulated their silhouettes with clever tailoring. They practiced the art of the glance, the kind of look that lingered just long enough to be remembered, never long enough to be shamed. Many of them kept diaries or wrote letters filled with observations on fashion, posture, perfumes. Some even wrote treatises on love, beauty, and behavior. In these writings, we glimpse a peculiar wisdom. They knew the game they were playing, and they played it well. For every noble lady who fretted over her modesty, there was a courtesan who wielded her beauty like a dagger. Men, too, were not immune to this manipulation. While their fashion was often framed as functional, layered, practically it was also deeply coded. A knight's tunic might be slashed to show the color of his family's heraldry. His belt, his boots, even the plume on his helmet said something about his taste, his wealth, his ambition. In court, a young man's attractiveness could determine his access to power. A squire might earn a lady's favor and with it, her father's supportive. He stood tall, smiled at the right time, and danced gracefully. Dance, in fact, became a subtle theater of beauty. Each movement a performance of youth, vitality, and breeding. Yet even among the most polished courtiers, there were cracks. Diaries and letters speak of jealousy, of noblemen mocked for receding hairlines, of women who fell from grace because their skin darkened after illness, of old lovers abandoned for younger, fresher faces. There was no protection from time, and time, in the medieval world, was a ruthless sculptor. It is here that we must pause and look at how the concept of beauty intersected with time itself. Unlike today's world, where beauty can be prolonged through surgery or digital illusion, medieval men and women aged in full view of their communities. There was no hiding a wrinkle, no erasing a scar. Age was not entirely devoid of dignity. Women, particularly widows, could gain respect and authority, but their beauty was considered a thing of the past, a withered flower pressed into memory. For men, the decline was often marked with quiet sorrow, a once beloved knight now too stiff to ride, a poet whose eyes no longer sparkled, a prince who once turned heads but now turned stomachs. And yet, even in decline, beauty could flicker. A soft voice, a sharp mind, a kind gesture. These became the final embers of aesthetic worth admired, though no longer coveted. Sometimes, they glowed more brightly in death than they ever had in life. Portraits painted after death, songs written for lost loves, grave markers describing fairest ladies and handsomest knights. In this way, beauty lingered beyond the flesh, becoming legend. But what of the other side of legend? The monstrous, the grotesque. Medieval culture was obsessed not only with what was beautiful, but with what was not. Bestiaries, those illuminated texts filled with fantastical creatures, delighted in describing deformity. One-legged men who hopped like birds, women with faces on their chests, hairy maidens from the far north. These stories weren't simply curiosities, they were warnings. They taught children what was to be admired and what was to be feared. And often, these monstrous depictions were mapped onto real people, those with birth defects, skin conditions, or unusual proportions. Their lives were difficult, not only for physical reasons, but because their appearances marked them as other in cities. Some of these individuals were shunned. Others were exploited, paraded in carnivals, or kept as curiosities in noble courts. In rare cases, they were protected or even loved. But more often, they became cautionary tales. Their names disappeared, but their features were remembered. And so, beauty defined not only who thrived, but who vanished. Yet amid all this rigidity, there were tiny rebellions. A girl might hide a strip of forbidden silk beneath her sleeve. A boy might spend too long gazing at himself in the rivers. Reflection. A nun might perfume her veil. A monk might write a love poem and burn it before morning prayers. These moments did not alter society, but they offered small cracks in its armor. In those cracks, beauty became something else, not currency, not control, but longing. And it is longing that reveals the deeper truth about medieval beauty. Beneath the paint, the powder, the posture, was always a yearning to be chosen, to be noticed, to be understood, to matter in a world that so often erased those who did not conform. This yearning spilled into art, into stained glass windows depicting saints with heartbreakingly serene faces, into frescoes of the Madonna with cheeks blushed just so, into love songs whispered in gardens, where the beloved was described as having lips like the petals of blood-red roses, and eyes that could drown even the proudest knight. Beauty in the medieval world, then, was both brutal and tender. It cut like a blade and healed like a balm. It lifted some, destroyed others. And always, always, it held power. The further we go, the more we will see how this power mutates. As empires fall and new ideas rise, as mirrors grow clearer and beliefs grow darker, the body will continue to bear the weight of meaning, and what was once a private ritual of beautification will become, slowly, terrifyingly, a public performance of control. But that is still to come. In the stillness of late evening, when candles burn low and the tapestries no longer conceal the drafts that sneak through the cracks of stone walls, the medieval mind often turned inward, toward guilt, toward longing, and often toward mirrors, both real and imagined. The face that met one's gaze was never neutral. It was a moral canvas, a statement, a question. And above all, it was a reflection of values not wholly one's own. Beauty, in this world, had long ceased to be a personal trait. It had become something larger, an echo of divine order, of social alignment, and of inner virtue. And in such a world, to look a certain way was to live a certain fate. Let us now enter the convent, that quiet space removed from worldly temptations. Here, beauty did not vanish, transformed. In the dim corridors of stone cloisters, where women dressed in modest habits and dedicated their lives to spiritual contemplation. Physical appearance was meant to be irrelevant, but it never truly was. Stories abound of nuns known for their delicate features, for their angelic faces, for the miraculous preservation of their youth even in old age. These accounts often served as signs of sanctity. A beautiful nun, who remained untouched by the usual decay of time, was seen not as vain, but as holy. Her beauty was recast not as temptation, but as a gift from God, a visual testimony to her purity. Some of the most detailed medieval writing about beauty actually comes from within these walls. Nuns wrote about their former lives at court, the jewelry they once wore, the perfumes they missed, the feel of silk against their skin. These confessions were not always marked by regret. Sometimes they carried an odd fondness, as though beauty while worldly still carried something sacred. the tension remained. Even here, among women who had renounced the flesh, the body continued to speak. That speaking body found even louder expression in religious mysticism. Take, for instance, the writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and mystic, whose visions blended theology, nature, and the human form in stunning detail. In her accounts, the body became a vessel of divine revelation. Light poured from the faces of saints. The Virgin Mary was often described in terms of her glow, her clarity, her incorruptibility. Holiness and beauty were intertwined, though always with caution, for too much admiration of the physical, even in sacred contexts, risked tipping into idolatry. This fine balance between the spiritual and the sensual ran deep. In medieval sermons, the faithful were often warned against the dangers of vanity, especially women. But even as priests condemned the use of cosmetics, the artworks inside those very churches depicted heavenly beings with golden curls, smooth brows, and perfect skin. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. And so, the average peasant, or noble nun, or squire, was left with a silent burden, to strive toward beauty, but never admit to it. To cultivate grace, but never seek praise. This conflict became even more intense in the great cities that began to rise across Europe: Florence, Paris, London, Cologne. Urbanization brought proximity, and proximity brought comparison. Suddenly, beauty was not just a rumor or a tale, it was on display. In markets, in churches, in alleys and bridges and festivals. And where there was comparison, there was competition. Young women in cities adapted their rituals accordingly. Street sellers hawked ground pearl powder and coal-black eyeliner. Apothecaries offered creams that promised to cool the face and dry the redness of wine. In certain districts, mirrors were even placed in shop fronts, encouraging women to adjust their veils, their collars, their smiles. It was the birth of something very modern, the public gaze and the self-body that bends beneath it. Men, too, were subject to this gaze, especially as guilds and professions became more stratified. A successful merchant needed to look successful. A clean face, smooth hands, and well-tailored doublets all signaled status and trustworthiness. In Venice, a banker's fingernails were expected to be free of dirt. In Bruges, a master tailor's posture and walk were scrutinized nearly as closely as the seams on his garments. Physical self-presentation was not optional, it was economic currency. But it was also dangerous. Because wherever beauty became a tool, it also became a weapon. Jealousy festered. Accusations grew. A woman who rose too quickly might be accused of witchcraft. A handsome man who charmed too many clients might be called a liar, or worse, a heretic. And in the courts of law, appearance played a subtle but undeniable role. Jurors, whether noble or common, were swayed not only by facts, but by faces. Consider this. During the Inquisitions and moral trials of the late medieval period, women who were considered too attractive were often met with suspicion. Beauty, after all, was a form of persuasion. And in a society built on fear of seduction, be it political, sexual, or spiritual, persuasion was dangerous. There are surviving trial records where entire accusations hinged on appearance. A merchant's wife was said to have bewitched a magistrate because he could not stop staring at her. A widow was accused of killing her husband because her beauty, it was said, belied her grief. Beauty, in such moments, ceased to be a gift. It became a verdict. And yet, people continued to chase it, not just out of desire, but out of survival. In an era where life was often short, brutal, and governed by systems beyond any individual's control, beauty offered one of the few avenues for influence. A well-dressed merchant's daughter might marry into nobility. A charming servant might gain favor in a household. A skilled court performer might earn a patron. These possibilities hinged on presentation, and so the effort continued. Let us look now at one of the most curious aspects of medieval beauty, the deliberate erasure of eyebrows. Yes, among many noblewomen, particularly in 14th and 15th century, England and France, it became fashionable to pluck the eyebrows clean off, along with the front portion of the hairline. The result was a high, domed forehead, thought to resemble intelligence, refinement, and spiritual grace. To modern eyes, the effect is strange, even unsettling. But in its time, it was deeply admired. Poems praised women with lofty brows like the vaults of heaven. Painters, especially those in Flemish and Burgundian courts, immortalized this look in triptychs and portrait panels. This was not merely a trend, it was an ideal, and like all ideals, it carried cost. Women spent hours scraping their skin, applying herbal concoctions to slow regrowth, and practicing gentle tilts of the head that emphasized the new forehead without appearing haughty. Some went further, using light chalk or paste to smooth the transition between scalp and brow, creating the illusion of celestial calm. It was absurd, perhaps, but no more absurd than the beauty practices we tolerate today. And the goal was the same, to appear effortlessly perfect. Despite the enormous effort behind the illusion, there were others who resisted these trends, of course. In rural regions, far from the courts and their polished vanities, beauty remained more practical. Broad hips meant strength in childbirth. Strong teeth suggested a good diet and health. Skin darkened by labor was not shameful, it was honorable. Songs were sung about milkmaids with cheeks like apples and arms like plows. Love stories unfolded not with poetry, but with glances stolen between chores, and here too, beauty mattered. It was less about status, more about attraction. But it was no less real. This contrast between rural and urban, between noble and common, between sacred and profane, shaped the medieval landscape like a patchwork quilt of ideals. No single standard held dominion over all, yet within each pocket of society, beauty was upheld with fierce loyalty. It was taught in whispers, modeled in silence, passed from mother to daughter, from knight to page, from poem to painting, and through it all, one thing remained constant. Beauty was never passive. It was active, vigilant, and often punishing. It required maintenance, sacrifice, and in many cases, submission. Even the act of rejecting beauty standards became a statement, one that could brand a woman as bitter, or a man as prideful. We are now approaching a turning point. Soon, the medieval world will begin to lean toward the early Renaissance. New philosophies will emerge. Humanism will question divine perfection. Artists will begin to study anatomy, not for virtue, but for verisimilitude. Mirrors will grow clearer. Science will challenge superstition, and beauty, ever adaptable, ever elusive will shift once more, but not yet. In the heart of the Middle Ages, beauty remains an enigma, a necessity, a curse, a blessing. It is the most delicate kind of power, the most dangerous to those who wield it too well. Night fell early in most of the medieval world, and with it came the rituals that accompanied private life. Doors were bolted, fires were stoked, women removed their wimples and veils, men unbuckled their belts and folded their tunics. What remained in those hours before sleep was quiet reflection, a time when even the proudest members of society could no longer avoid the truth of their own faces. Mirrors, while rare, were increasingly present among the wealthy, and in the flicker of candlelight, the human face became something wholly vulnerable and brutally honest. To truly understand medieval beauty, we must now shift our gaze to the painters, the poets, the chroniclers, those who recorded beauty not merely as it appeared, but as it was imagined. The visual and literary arts of the medieval period did not strive for realism as much as they aimed to reflect ideals. Beauty in art was often symbolic, exaggerated, made to conform to theological or philosophical values. And in this symbolic space, we find fascinating distortions, deliberate choices that betray a society obsessed not just with looking good, but with looking right. Take, for example, medieval portraiture. Most women depicted in the paintings of the 13th through 15th centuries appear with impossibly smooth skin, small pursed lips, elongated necks, and most noticeably enormously high foreheads. It was not unusual to see the hairline painted halfway back the skull, giving the illusion of a larger cranium and a serene, intelligent gaze. There was, in this aesthetic, a desire to distance the female face from earthiness, from lust, from heat. Coldness, pale, distant, almost ghostly, was considered beautiful because it suggested control. Passion was dangerous. Modesty was divine. These images were not merely fantasy, they were aspirational. Women sought to match them through real effort. Recipes for skin whitening included vinegar, crushed pearls, and lead-based pastes. To prevent sun-darkening, noblewomen wore wide-brimmed hats, stayed indoors, and carried parasols. A tan, in most of Christian Europe, marked a woman as lower-class, someone who worked the fields, someone who sweated, someone who toiled. And beauty, as we have already seen, was never about health. It was about separation, distance from labor, distance from desire. In contrast, the male figure in medieval imagery often struck a balance between strength and serenity. Knights, saints, kings, all were shown with strong shoulders, controlled expressions, and neatly curled hair. A straight nose, well-aligned teeth, and clear skin were praised features, though more forgiving than for women. A man might be weathered by war, scarred by battle, or tanned by the sun, and still retain his status as attractive, so long as those marks were signs of honor and not disgrace. Beauty in men was allowed to coexist with experience. For women, beauty had to remain untouched. Let us not forget the power of the written word in shaping these ideals. Medieval literature was overflowing with love poems, chansons de geste, and courtly romances that idealized beauty to the point of divinity. Women were described in florid metaphors like sapphires, skin like alabaster, lips like roses just opening to the sun. These were not idle compliments, they were codified expectations. When a knight sang of his beloved's perfection, he was not simply praising her, he was confirming what society told him beauty should be, but these ideals were not without their irony. Many of the same poets who praised women for their chastity also longed for their seduction. The ideal lady was at once distant and accessible, modest and responsive, silent and expressive. These contradictions revealed the impossible tightrope. Women were asked to walk, be beautiful, but not vain, be noticed, but not bold, be graceful, but not assertive. Any misstep invited ridicule, suspicion, or worse, in the courts of southern France, particularly during the height of the troubadour tradition. These contradictions became even more pronounced. Courtly love, a stylized form of romantic admiration, often between a nobleman and a married lady, celebrated beauty as a kind of torment. The woman was untouchable, and therefore irresistible. Her appearance was analyzed, idealized, dissected. A strand of hair might inspire entire verses. The glimpse of an ankle could cause weeks of poetry. But this kind of beauty was not liberating. It was a prison. The woman became a symbol, not a person. These symbolic representations made their way into fashion as well. Consider the hennin, the tall, conical hat often worn by noble women in 15th century Burgundy and France. Sometimes several feet high, and often veiled in translucent silk. The hennin exaggerated the length of the body and elevated the silhouette to surreal dimensions. It made the woman appear taller, more ethereal, less earthly, but it also limited her movement, distorted her posture, and required delicate balance. Beauty demanded inconvenience, even absurdity. The woman became her own monument, admired, but immobilized, in the same period. Bodices became tighter, sleeves more elaborate, shoes more pointed. A noblewoman might require assistance from multiple attendants just to get dressed, reinforcing the idea that beauty belonged to those who could afford the time, space, and help required to maintain it. There was, at the heart of medieval beauty, a deeply economic truth. Only the privileged could conform to its ideals. But among the poor, those who could not afford hennins or pearl-des powders, a different kind of beauty quietly persisted. It was practical, yes, but not without poetry. Folk ballads sung by shepherds spoke of lovers with sun-darkened cheeks and tangled hair. Rural weddings celebrated strong backs and bright eyes. In these circles, beauty was tied not to fragility, but to life, robust, enduring, and real. This beauty was rarely recorded in books or painted on panels, but it thrived nonetheless. Passed down in stories and memories and names carved into tree bark. As towns expanded and trade routes grew busier, new materials and ideals began to flow in from distant lands. Silks from the East, spices from India, cosmetics from the Islamic world all brought fresh textures, scents, and ideas into European life. And with them came new visions of beauty. Darker eyes lined with kohl, hair oiled with jasmine, skin scented with musk or frankincense. These features, once considered foreign or suspect, began to merge with local trends, especially in cosmopolitan cities like Venice or Cordoba. But this blending sparked anxiety as well as fascination. The Church, ever watchful, condemned many of these imported beautifying practices as vanity or witchcraft. Preachers warned that perfumes enticed demons, that darkened eyes were a sign of pride. that to decorate the body was to deny God's design. And yet, these practices continued covertly, carefully, because even in the face of condemnation, beauty persisted. One cannot overstate the influence of fear in this error, on only fear of sin, but fear of other people's perceptions. A woman's reputation could be shattered by whispers. A man's honor could be questioned if he cared too much for his clothing. And so, beauty walked hand in hand with danger. To look too beautiful was to invite suspicion. But to look careless was to risk being overlooked entirely. This tightrope extended even to mourning. When someone died, beauty had its own code. Widows were expected to veil their faces, wear black or gray, and display an outward appearance of sorrow. But beneath the surface, there were rules about how much mourning was too much or not enough. A widow who looked too plain might seem cold. One who appeared too radiant was surely scheming for remarriage. Some women, torn between grief and expectation, applied light powder to hide their tears, or pinched their cheeks to appear more pale, more tragic. In death, as in life, beauty was curated. There is something almost unbearable in all of this. The weight that medieval people carried not just to survive hunger, war, and disease, but to remain presentable while doing so. And not merely presentable, but desirable, impressive, graceful. Whether through noble polish or rustic charm, the pressure was relentless. And yet, they met it. Day after day, year after year, through plagues and prayers and politics, through love and loss and lineage, and what remains now, centuries later, are traces. Paintings, faded and cracked. Poems, their ink browned with age. Portraits of women with half-earsed smiles. Manuscripts filled with herbal recipes and secret tips for whitening the neck or narrowing the waist. All of it speaks of people who wanted not to be perfect, but to be seen, to matter, to glow, if only for a moment, in a world darkened by so many shadows. As we step forward into the next chapters, we will watch this desire evolve. As Renaissance light begins to filter in through the stained glass of medieval rigidity, beauty will find new forms, new freedoms, new prisons. And the face in the mirror, always familiar, always strange, will begin to change. The tolling of bells was a sound that marked time in the medieval world, not clocks, not alarms, but a deep, resonant voice that reminded the living of prayers, of duties, of death. And just as bells marked the rhythm of daily life, beauty too had its seasons. It changed with the hours, the years, the reigns of kings, the moods of popes. There was no fixed moment where beauty paused and declared itself final. Rather, it drifted, at times obvious, at times imperceptibly, always reshaping the human sense of worth and presence in the world, as the late Middle Ages gave way to something brighter, sharper, and in many ways more where the seeds of the Renaissance began to stir beneath the soil of tradition. Though the Renaissance is often viewed as a clean break from the medieval, the truth is before Florence burst into artistic bloom, before humanism took hold, beauty had already started to evolve quietly, slowly, through the pens of thinkers and the pigments of painters who questioned whether the body might hold more than sin and shame. Whether perhaps it could be a mirror of the soul. One cannot speak of this shift without mentioning the influence of classical revival. Greek and Roman texts, long buried or ignored in the Christian centuries, began to re-emerge through the hands of Arab scholars, Jewish translators, and European collectors who dared to look backward. In these ancient scrolls, medieval minds found something startling: an idea of beauty not bound entirely to modesty or morality, but to proportion, harmony, and balance. The Greeks, they read, had measured beauty through mathematics. The Romans had celebrated the nude form without shame. For some, this was dangerous heresy. For others, it was thrilling revelation. And so, in the waning centuries of the Middle Ages, beauty became something to be studied, not just admired or feared, but analyzed. Treatises appeared, not religious sermons, but proto-scientific writings. The golden ratio of the face, on the ideal length of limbs, on the curvature of the brow. Painters began sketching anatomy with a hunger not just for grace, but for accuracy. The ideal body moved from being a spiritual metaphor to a physical project, yet the shift was not universal. In most of Europe, especially in rural areas and among devout communities, the old standards still held firm. Modesty, pallor, delicacy, these remained the marks of a virtuous woman. But in the courts of the increasingly powerful merchant-class Florentine bankers, Venetian traders, Burgundian princessa, new face began to emerge. It was fuller, more sensuous. Cheeks became round rather than gaunt. The mouth softened. The eyes grew expressive. The brows dark and curved. This woman still adhered to ideals of decorum, but she possessed a glow not born from suffering, but from confidence. Cosmetics responded accordingly. Where once beauty potions promised to make the wearer appear frail and ethereal, now they promised vitality. Ointments of crushed berries, vermilion and cochineal, were used to tint the lips and cheeks. Teeth were rubbed with sage and charcoal to appear white. Hair was dyed using herbs, copper, dust, and even urine, though the latter was often reserved for the bold or the desperate. A golden red hue, inspired by ancient statues and contemporary Venetian muses, became particularly sought after. Women would sit in the sun for hours with their hair spread over wide wooden boards, bleaching it with mixtures designed to mimic the warmth of classical beauty. In men, a similar transformation occurred. While the rugged knight of the earlier Middle Ages had been idealized for his brute strength and religious fervor, the later medieval gentleman was praised for his wit, style, and elegance. Courtly poets began to praise not only a man's courage, but his clothing, his scent, his hair. A well-shaped beard became fashionable, again trimmed. Not wild Anne's shoes grew increasingly elaborate, with long pointed toes that sometimes required strings to tie them to the calf. Beauty, for men, returned as an art, not merely a consequence of war or labor. The salons and gatherings of these wealthier courts began to resemble something quite modern, places where beauty, intelligence, and performance collided. Women recited poetry. Men played instruments. Hair was curled and perfumed. Faces lightly powdered. Garments embroidered with gold thread and lined with foreign fur. Mirrors became more common, now polished glass instead of polished metal, and with each passing year, the act of looking at oneself grew less sinful, more curious. But not all were convinced. Many within the church looked upon this blooming self-awareness with disdain. Preachers warned against the worship of the self, and beauty was once again linked to moral weakness. Sumptuary laws returned in force. especially in cities like Florence and Paris, where wealthy merchants began to outshine the old nobility. Laws were passed limiting how many rings a man could wear, how transparent a woman's veil could be, what fabrics could be used by what class. The battle for beauty became, in part, a battle for social control. It was during this time that a new kind of figure entered public discourse, the beautiful woman as threat. Not merely temptation, as in the earlier centuries, but destruction. The figure of the siren, the witch, the succubus, these all merged into a singular archetype, the dangerously beautiful woman. She appeared in sermons, in plays, in paintings, always too lovely to be safe, always too well dressed to be trustworthy. And behind every warning was a deeper anxiety that beauty, when wielded by a woman, might overpower even kings and bishops, that it could bend reason, that it could unravel order, and indeed, beauty was beginning to gain autonomy. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, we see women commissioning portraits of themselves, not just in the context of marriage or faith, but alone. These portraits were not always public, but they existed, and their very existence hinted at a new idea, that a woman might wish to see herself not through the eyes of a husband, or a confessor, or a suitor, but her own. It was a quiet revolution, a subtle rebellion, but it marked the beginning of beauty as self-possession. In poetry too, the language shifted. While earlier writers described women as fragile, angelic, and distant, the new generation of poets especially in Italy began to paint their muses as real, breathing, thinking creatures. Petrarch's Laura, for example, was idealized, yes, but also intelligent, unattainable, and strangely grounded. Her beauty was not just physical, it was spiritual, mental, melancholic. The body, in these poems, became a doorway, not a destination. And yet, even as these more human visions of beauty emerged, the machinery of control remained. Women were still largely bound by marriage contracts, by reputations, by the relentless watchfulness of society. Their ability to shape their own appearance was growing, but so was the cost of misstep. A painted cheek in the wrong setting could still earn a woman's scorn. A man who spent too long on his attire might be called soft, effeminate, even sinful. The walls had begun to crack, but they still stood. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, in the Islamic world and parts of Moorish Spain, beauty standards flourished in complex and highly aesthetic cultures. There, poetry praised both male and female beauty with unapologetic passion. Eyes were admired not for modesty, but for their power to intoxicate. Skin was celebrated in shades of gold, bronze, and brown. And cosmetics were seen as acts of refinement, not corruption. These ideals would slowly seep into Europe through trade, travel, and conquest, challenging and enriching the narrow models held by Northern Christians. This cross-pollination was not always peaceful. Sometimes it brought conflict, suspicion, and rejection, but often it brought inspiration. And so, in the final breaths of the medieval era, European beauty stood on a precarious edge, part shadow, part illumination. Its roots still twisted through fear and dogma, but its branches reached toward curiosity, experimentation, and the possibility of joy. As the Renaissance approached, beauty would no longer remain a static ideal imposed from above. It would become a question, a pursuit. a dialogue between the past and the present, between heaven and earth, between the mirror and the soul. But before that dawn breaks, we still have more night to cross, more rituals, more legends, more forgotten names that once lit up rooms with nothing more than a glance. The darkness before the Renaissance was not a silence, but a low hum, a slow, building melody of change that echoed through the stone corridors of abbeys and the tiled palaces of merchant families alike. It was the hum of something awakening, the slow realization that the world, and everything within it, was far more complex than the church had long insisted. Beauty, once chained to virtue and modesty, began to tug at its leash, and in doing so, it revealed what it had always been, a mirror of the age. As the late medieval period drifted toward the early 15th century, the hunger for knowledge about the body, the world, the heavens. No longer were people content with metaphors alone. They wanted texture, shadow, movement, and that desire extended to human appearance. In workshops across Florence, Bruges, and Avignon, artists began studying musculature, light, and facial asymmetry. Not to idealize the divine but to understand the human. Beauty was not being abandoned. It was being redefined. But while the brushstrokes of painters and the verses of poets edged toward something revolutionary, the average person still lived within a framework of expectation that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. A woman's appearance continued to be her introduction, her currency, her safeguard and her trap. From the moment she stepped outside her home, she was observed, assessed, whispered about, and what was being measured was not merely attractiveness, but obedience. Did she look as a good woman should? Was her skin pale enough? Was her gait humble? Her hair properly hidden beneath her veil or hood? These questions were not limited to the upper classes. Even in the villages, among farmers and bakers and blacksmiths, appearance played a quiet but powerful role. A man might choose a wife based not just on her dowry or family standing, but on how well she kept her hair braided, how clean her fingernails appeared, how gracefully she curtsied during feast days. Beauty was often conflated with discipline or special. In women, the implication was clear. A woman who cared for her appearance must also care for her home, her children, her virtue. Beauty became a shorthand for trustworthiness. And yet, there were spaces brief, flickering, and charged where women could perform beauty for beauty's sake. Festivals, for instance, were liminal moments in time. During Carnival, May Day, and local saints' days, the rigid roles of everyday life were relaxed. Women might wear brighter colors, looser sleeves, and even go unveiled. In some regions, elaborate headdresses and face paint were worn, not to seduce, but to celebrate. Beauty in these contexts became theatrical, jubilant, even mischievous. The same was true in the courts of entertainment. Traveling actors and dancers, jugglers and troubadours often pushed the boundaries of acceptable appearance. Painted cheeks, exaggerated gestures, exposed ankles, these were tools of performance. And the audiences who watched them often viewed such flourishes with a blend of scandal and fascination. These performers lived outside the usual social hierarchy. Their beauty was suspect, yes, but also magnetic. They were permitted liberties denied to respectable women and restrained men, but only so long as they remained outsiders. Some of the most intriguing glimpses of these performative beauty practices come from court records and travel diaries. Foreign emissaries wrote of painted women in French masquerades, or men whose fingers glisten with silver rings and whose faces are smoother than a maiden's. The underlying tone was always tinged with judgment, but also with envy. Because even as preachers thundered against vanity, the urge to ornament, to impress, to transform, remained universal. Let us pause to consider hair an obsession as old as civilization itself. In medieval Europe, hair was more than fiber. It was identity, power, and danger, all wrapped into one. A woman's hair, especially if long and unbound, was often seen as sensual, even wild. For this reason, unmarried girls were sometimes permitted to wear their hair down during special rites, like First Communion or festivals, but wives and widows were expected to keep it concealed. To see a married woman with her hair loose in public was to question her modesty, her morality even. But within the safety of private rooms, hair became a canvas. Noble women brushed and braided their hair daily, perfuming it with oils of rosemary, lavender, or orange blossom. Elaborate styles were pinned with golden needles, ribbons, and tiny decorative bells. In some regions, especially among the aristocracy, the hairline was plucked far back to extend the forehead, creating that distinctive egg-shaped look that defined high medieval beauty. The pain involved in such grooming rituals was often intense, but it was a pain endured with quiet pride, because to suffer for beauty was to declare one's worthiness of it. Men, too, had their own hair customs. Beards fell in and out of fashion, depending on the decade and region. In early medieval times, a full beard could signify strength and virility. But by the 14th century, clean-shaven faces with carefully shaped hair became more common among courtiers and scholars. A man's hair might be curled, lightly scented, or dyed. These choices were not merely about fashion. They were declarations of allegiance to a certain world, one of refinement, civility, and courtly ambition. The Church, ever wary of excess, tried to resist these trends. Ecclesiastical texts warned against altering the body, which was considered God's design, and yet, within monastic walls, another kind of beauty was revered. Illuminated manuscripts, created painstakingly by monks and nuns, were filled with figures of saints and angels rendered with delicate features, serene expressions, and impossibly graceful hands. These were not real people, they were ideals. But those ideals fed back into society, creating a strange loop in which beauty was condemned and yet obsessively depicted. This paradox extended to real saints and holy women, many of whom were described in hagiographies with great physical detail. Saint Agnes was said to have hair like polished gold. Saint Catherine's eyes were clearer than spring water. Even martyrs, in death, were sometimes described as glowing with an unnatural, divine radiance. Beauty, in these stories, became proof of sanctity. And yet, should a living woman display similar features, she might be accused of pride. Thus, beauty was safest when dead, or behind stained glass. The tension between body and soul was most visible during public punishments. When a woman was accused of adultery, witchcraft, or heresy, her appearance was often the first thing condemned. She was stripped of finery, her hair cut short, her skin marked with ash or mud. The goal was not just to punish but to unbeautify, to take back the power that her appearance had lent her. There was no clearer sign that beauty, even then, still meant influence. And yet, even in these brutal rituals, the crowd's gaze remained fixed, curious, hungry, fearful, because they knew, perhaps, without ever saying it aloud, that beauty could unmake a man, topple a marriage, divide a city, that it could lift a poor girl from obscurity, or turn a noblewoman into a pariah, that it was never passive, always alive, always watching. Letters from the late 14th century reveal fascinating insights into how people discussed beauty in private. Men wrote to one another describing women's eyes, the line of a throat, the softness of hands. Women, too, confided in each other about perfumes, flattering sleeves, powders that could reduce blemishes or redden the lips. In one particularly striking letter from a young Florentine woman to her cousin, she writes, "I fear I am becoming too beautiful for safety. I wear my darkest veil now, and still, they look." Within that single sentence lies the entire medieval dilemma. Beauty was both gift and risk. As the 15th century loomed, the boundary between medieval and modern beauty standards began to blur. Art became more daring. Portraits showed depth of character, not just perfection. Mirrors became household items among the upper class. Books on etiquette, grooming, and the proper virtues of a wife were printed and distributed. Slowly, beauty ceased to be something one was born into and began to be something one could cultivate, master, even control. But the shadow of the past still clung, because even as beauty grew more accessible, its cost remained steep. To be beautiful still meant to be visible. And to be visible, in the medieval world, was always to be vulnerable. Soon, that visibility would be challenged not only by art and science, but by fire and reformation. New powers would rise, old structures would crumble, and the very definition of the human form would change forever. But in this stillness, this last echo of the medieval night, we see beauty as it once was, fragile, luminous, suffocating, and free. As dawn slowly rose on the 15th century, the medieval world found itself poised between two selves. One foot remained firmly planted in the sacred soil of Tridentian church. Bells still marked the hours. Guilds maintained their strict hierarchies, and women's modesty was still measured by how invisible they could remain. But the other foot was already stepping into something uncertain and new. The air was changing. In the city's wealth no longer belonged only to old families and noble bloodlines. Merchants grew powerful. Artists were paid more than knights. Scholars began to speak not only of heaven, but of humanity. And with that, beauty, always the silent bellwether of cultural change, shifted again. The Renaissance had not yet arrived in full, but its fingers had begun to comb through the thick, veiled hair of the medieval mind. One could sense the awakening in the way people began to look at themselves, not just in the glass or in each other's eyes, but in art, in writing, in architecture. It was subtle at first. A slight emphasis on facial realism in a painting. A sonnet that lingered too long on the description of a woman's dimpled smile. A sculpture that portrayed a human body not in agony or adoration, but in relaxation, mid-breath, as though alive. This shift carried profound consequences, because to observe oneself as a subject, and not merely as a vessel for morality or lineage, was a dangerous and exhilarating step toward selfhood. and selfhood is inseparable from beauty. As long as the human face has existed, it has longed not just to be shined but to be recognized, understood, desired. In Florence, a city rapidly becoming the incubator of Renaissance thought, beauty became entwined with ambition. It was no longer enough to be born attractive or noble. A new kind of grooming emerged, one that blended taste, intellect, and appearance. Men plucked their brows and perfumed their tunics. Women studied the art of walking with controlled grace, of speaking just long enough to intrigue but not provoke. This was not beauty in isolation. It was performance. And nowhere was this more visible than in the portraits commissioned by rising merchant families. These portraits, often painted by artists who would soon become legends, tell us more than court records ever could. In them, we see women posed in profile, their skin nearly translucent, their eyes lowered demurely, but their garments speak volumes: fur-lined sleeves, delicately stitched bodices, strands of pearls wrapped like armor around necks that once bent to collect water from communal fountains. These women were not aristocrats by birth, but by effort. Their beauty was constructed, curated, painstakingly shaped into legitimacy. Through their appearance, they carved space for themselves in a world that had not yet fully made room. Men, too, used beauty strategically. In a culture where birthright no longer guaranteed survival, appearance became political. A well-dressed man signaled competence, reliability, power. A youth with good teeth and shining hair might rise quickly in a court, when a patron, secure a dowry. Even clergy supposedly immune to vanity began to care more openly for their robes, their posture, their beards. In the shadow of reform, as the church began to fracture under its own contradictions, outer presentation was no longer merely about virtue. It was about influence, and influence could not afford to look poor. Still, there were limits. Beauty remained dangerous. A woman too carefully adorned could be accused of harboring ambitions beyond her station. A man too invested in fragrance or color might be ridiculed as effeminate. These suspicions, though whispered, had teeth. In a world where social roles were still deeply gendered, beauty was always being measured against expectations. A beautiful woman had to walk the razor's edge between charm and chastity. A beautiful man had to be impressive without appearing vain. Failure to do so could be fatal, if not to one's life, then certainly to one's reputation. In literature, this tension played out in complex, sometimes contradictory ways. The courtly tradition still held sway. Women were idealized, their beauty described in impossible detail, their bodies repositories of purity and longing. But newer voices began to question this ideal. In the sonnets of Petrarch and Boccaccio's Decameron, we find glimpses of beauty that are not just virtuous, but witty, clever, assertive. The women in these stories possess agency. Their beauty is not just a gift, they wield it, manipulate it, subvert it. And the men, they fall for them, not out of obligation, but because they are drawn to the possibility of being understood. Meanwhile, among the peasantry and working class, standards of beauty evolved with quieter, more practical shifts. A girl was praised for her healthy color, strong teeth, and clean hands. A boy's broad shoulders and firm stance mattered more than his jawline. But even here, the influence of rising cultural trends seeped in. In taverns and market squares, stories and songs told of noble women with silver combs and long lashes, of knights who wore silk beneath their armor. People imagined beauty they could never afford but still tried to imitate, a ribbon here, a bit of rouge stolen from a noble's table, a new way of tying the hair, seen once during a procession and remembered forever. And while we often speak of European beauty standards as monolithic, the truth is far more nuanced. In the south of Spain, still bearing the influence of centuries of Islamic rule, dark eyes and olive skin were prized. In the north, where colder climates made pale skin more common, fairness was still seen as desirable but increasingly contrast became fashionable. A pale face set against dark hair, light lashes against kohl-lined lids. Diversity of beauty began, slowly, to make its way into the canon. Cosmetics, though officially condemned by many clergy, thrived in secret. Recipes circulated among women passed between servants and ladies alike. Rosewater for soft skin, burnt almonds for contouring, lead paste for whitening, dangerous, yes, but effective. In some cities, entire underground economies formed around these ingredients. Apothecaries turned a blind eye. Market vendors hid supplies beneath layers of herbs, because demand always found a way. Even when outlawed, the pursuit of beauty could not be legislated away. Perhaps most telling is the rise of mirrors, not just as objects, but as symbols. A mirror is never passive. It invites interrogation, and the increasing availability of mirrors among the wealthy marked a turning point in the relationship between appearance and identity. People no longer looked at themselves solely to check if they were presentable. They began to look for recognition, for transformation, for affirmation, and with that shift came a new kind of self-awareness, one that had implications far beyond fashion. Because when people see themselves clearly, they begin to imagine how others might see them differently. And in imagining that, they begin to dream of changing the narrative altogether. This, more than any single powder or paint, is what beauty offered in the final centuries of the medieval age. A story, a possibility, a performance, a challenge. It was no longer just about fitting into the mold. It was about stretching it, bending it, sometimes even breaking it. Soon, that break would come exploding through frescoes and anatomy studies and printed treatises that dared to claim the human form was not a prison, but a masterpiece. But that moment was not yet. The medieval world still lingered, heavy with incense and old songs. The halls of power were still guarded by men who feared what a beautiful woman might mean. The fields were still tilled by hands too calloused to wear rings. The churches still warned against the painted face. And yet behind closed doors, before mirrors lit by flickering flame, change had already begun. It would take generations for beauty to become freedom. But in these final chapters of the medieval age, beauty became something else. It became intention, a decision, a whisper of rebellion that said, even if the world sees me only as a wife, a servant, a daughter, see more, I am more, and I will be seen. The medieval world, by the early 15th century, had reached a point of contradiction so deep and complex that it could no longer contain the growing tensions between reverence and rebellion, structure and expression, spirit and flesh. And nowhere were these contradictions more vivid, more exposed than in the pursuit and performance of beauty. Beauty was no longer merely seen. It was now something worn like armor, cultivated like a garden, hidden like a sin, and displayed like a trophy. The face became both mask and map, and beneath every layer of powder or modesty lay the same burning desire, to matter, but to understand the full weight of that desire. We must walk deeper into the private spaces of medieval life, into the bedchambers, the confessionals, the market stalls, the kitchens. We must ask what it meant for a woman in a provincial town, or a man in a crowded guild hall, to wake each day and face a society that judged them long before they spoke a word, in a time where identity was largely inherited, where one's class, faith, and family dictated nearly every opportunity. The body became one of the only realms where a person might claim even the smallest agency, and so they did. Quietly, carefully, through rituals that appear ordinary on the surface, but beneath reveal acts of astonishing defiance or longing. A woman wakes before dawn not simply to prepare her home, but to massage a cream of egg white and powdered pearl into her cheeks. She plucks stray hairs from her brow and pins her veil in a way that shows a sliver more of her jawline than custom recommends. Her husband may not notice, her priest may disapprove, but she sees herself and, in doing so, feels momentarily in control of a life otherwise hemmed in by obedience. Elsewhere, a young apprentice saves his wages not for tools or books, but for a second-hand doublet in a rare shade of green. It doesn't fit him perfectly, but it makes his shoulders look broader, his waist tighter, his walk more purposeful. When he wears it through the town square, he watches people glance, just briefly, and those glances stay with him longer than they should. He has made himself visible. He has turned his body into a statement. These small acts, repeated in countless variations across villages and cities, did not dismantle the systems of control, but they did carve cracks into them. And through those cracks, the light of the Renaissance would soon pour. But before that transformation could fully arrive, medieval beauty continued to dance between extremes. On one hand, it grew more codified. Instructional books began to circulate, not widely, but enough to be felt. These books offered rules for noble grooming, how to shape the beard to appear learned, how to use wax and honey to polish the skin, which colors best suited which complexions. Some of these manuals were practical, others were philosophical, linking physical traits to moral attributes. A wide forehead signified wisdom, delicate fingers implied gentleness. A pointed chin might be read as cunning. These ideas seeped into every corner of life, including matchmaking. Courtship, particularly among the wealthy, became a theater of appearances. Portraits were exchanged like letters. Families studied the expressions and symmetry of potential spouses. Love, though present in song and story, rarely stood alone. A suitor who lacked beauty or worse, lacked the social ability to appear beautiful might find himself dismissed before his virtues were even considered. The same was true for women. A lady might be clever, capable, and kind, but if her face bore scars from illness, if her figure was deemed too full or too thin, if her hands showed the wear of labor, she risked becoming invisible in the eyes of those who controlled her fate. And so, beauty became not just desirable, but necessary. A ticket to survival, a currency more powerful, in some cases, than gold. It was during this time that beauty aids began to take on an almost mythic reputation. Recipes passed from generation to generation, wrapped in secrecy and hope. Some were grounded in folk knowledge, chamomile for bright skin, vinegar for shine, ashes for exfoliation. Others veered into dangerous territory. White lead paste, applied to the face for paleness, caused slow poisoning that was often mistaken for divine frailty. Belladonna drops, used to dilate the pupils and create a dreamy gaze, could destroy vision with prolonged use, but people continued to use them because the promise of beauty, a good marriage, a better station, a brief escape from obscurity was worth almost any risk. Yet alongside this calculated beauty emerged another kind, one rarely recorded in formal histories but preserved in letters, songs, and whispers. It was the beauty of lovers in quiet corners, of midwives singing to newborns, of dancers barefoot on dew-drenched grass. This beauty did not seek approval. It did not follow rules. It lived in gestures, in glances, in imperfections. It reminded those who encountered it that beauty was not always performance. It could also be presence. And this presence found voice in art. As painters grew more ambitious, their subjects grew more real. Wrinkles began to appear in portraits not as flaws, but as stories. Hairlines were no longer pushed back to absurdity. Instead, strands were rendered in soft, natural waves. Expressions became complex. A woman might look amused, curious, even tired. A man's face might show both pride and uncertainty. This realism, still wrapped in elegance, marked a new respect for the human form. Beauty was no longer the absence of blemish, it was the presence of life. Even religious art began to shift. While saints and angels were still depicted in idealized forms, there was an increasing emphasis on their humanity. The Virgin Mary, once a static figure of untouchable grace, began to appear younger, more emotional, more physically real. Christ, once portrayed as remote and regal, now bore bruises, wounds, sweat. These changes were not mere aesthetic choices, they reflected a deeper theological evolution. The divine was moving closer to the earthly, and in doing so, it opened the door for people to view their own bodies with less shame, more possibility. But with possibility came new forms of anxiety. As beauty became more democratized, more visible, more varied, it also became more competitive. Among the rising middle class, there emerged a desperation to emulate the elite. Tailors began to copy court fashions in cheaper fabrics. Cosmetics once reserved for queens were now found in modest homes, diluted and improvised. A merchant's daughter might appear at a feast looking nearly as polished as a noblewoman, and this blurring of class lines created unease. Sumptuary laws, long a tool for controlling excess, returned with harsh enforcement. Officials issued fines for wearing noble colors without title. Tailors were arrested for copying royal patterns. Even children's clothing became subject to scrutiny. But despite these laws, the tide could not be reversed. Beauty, once the strict domain of the few, was now in the hands of many. And that democratization, however fragile, threatened the very foundation of medieval hierarchy. This tension reached its height in the cities Florence, Paris, London, where fashion was both weapon and shield. A woman entering a cathedral in a velvet gown and painted cheeks could provoke both admiration and condemnation. A man wearing imported silk might be celebrated at one gathering and scorned at the next. Appearances became a language everyone spoke, but few mastered. One misstep, One misunderstood gesture could unravel everything. Yet still, they tried. Because to be beautiful, even briefly, was to matter, to interrupt the drudgery of daily life, to create a moment of meaning in a world where so much was out of one's control. And now, standing at the threshold of the Renaissance, we begin to see beauty not as a reflection of divine will or social structure, but as a reflection of the self, the individual, the soul made visible. The medieval era, so often dismissed as dark or stagnant, gave birth to this transformation through contradiction, through suffering, through desire. It carved, layer by layer, the foundation upon which modern beauty would rise, not always kinder, not always freer, but undeniably more personal. What comes next is not a clean break. It is a continuation, a flowering of all that has come before. The powders remain, the poems deepen, the gaze grows longer, and the face remains, forever looking back. As the 15th century unfolded, the interplay between tradition and innovation grew ever more intricate, particularly in the realm of beauty. The medieval tapestry, woven with threads of religion, social hierarchy, and cultural ideals, began to shimmer with new colors and patterns. To truly grasp the complexity of beauty standards during this time, one must not only examine the outward appearances, but also understand the forces that shaped those appearances, the economics, the politics, and the daily struggles of ordinary people who aspired, resisted, or simply navigated these expectations. Medieval beauty was, at its core, an emblem of order. The prevailing belief was that outer beauty mirrored inner virtue, and thus maintaining one's appearance was a moral responsibility. This principle was not confined to the aristocracy, but permeated all levels of society. Even peasants aspired to a semblance of neatness and cleanliness, which were considered reflections of a godly life. Bathing habits, though often misunderstood in modern portrayals, were more common than popularly assumed, especially among wealthier classes who had access to heated baths and perfumed waters. Cleanliness was both practical and symbolic, a way to align oneself with divine purity. Yet, the medieval conception of beauty was paradoxical. On one hand, excessive concern for appearance was condemned as vanity, a sin that could lead the soul astray. On the other, deliberate cultivation of beauty was encouraged, so long as it served to honor God and maintain social harmony. This delicate balance informed everything from dress codes to grooming rituals. A noblewoman might spend hours ensuring her hair was perfectly arranged beneath a wimple, not to attract lustful gazes, but to exemplify her discipline and piety. Similarly, a knight's polished armor and well-maintained beard were outward signs of his readiness to defend faith and king. The role of women in this schema was particularly complex. They were expected to embody chastity, modesty, and grace, often enforced through rigid social codes. Their bodies were both revered and feared, symbols of life and temptation alike. This ambivalence manifested vividly in how beauty was portrayed. In art and literature, female saints were often depicted as radiant, yet clothed in humility. Meanwhile, secular women's beauty was frequently linked to their status and behavior, underscoring the belief that appearance was inseparable from character. Clothing served as a potent marker of beauty and social position. The sumptuary laws, enacted intermittently throughout the medieval period, dictated who could wear what materials and colors. These regulations were not merely about aesthetics, but about preserving social order. Rich fabrics like silk, velvet, and brocade were reserved for the nobility, while commoners wore simpler wool or linen. Color symbolism was also significant. Purple, associated with royalty and divinity, was jealously guarded. Yet, despite legal constraints, fashion was a dynamic and evolving language. People sought to express identity and aspiration through subtle variations within their means: embroidery patterns, jewelry choices, even the cut of a sleeve. Hairstyles, too, were rich in meaning. In many regions, a woman's hair was considered so potent that it needed to be carefully controlled. Married women typically covered their hair, signaling their marital status and respectability. Widows might wear black veils, symbolizing mourning, but also dignity. Young unmarried women sometimes wore their hair loose or braided, which was a mark of youth and availability. Among the elite, hair was often lightened artificially to achieve the high forehead ideal, considered a sign of intelligence and nobility. This was achieved through plucking or shaving the hairline, a painful and time-consuming practice that underscored the lengths to which people would go to conform to beauty ideals. Makeup was another domain where medieval beauty reveals its contradictions. While the church officially condemned cosmetics as deceitful, many women across social strata used them discreetly. Pale skin was prized, as it signaled a life free from manual labor. To achieve this, women applied white lead-based powders, which unfortunately caused skin damage and poisoning over time. Rouge, made from crushed berries or minerals, added color to cheeks and lips, while coal or soot was used to darken eyelashes and eyebrows, framing the eyes in dramatic contrast. These practices were acts of subtle rebellion and self-care, performed in private spaces where societal judgment was less immediate. Men's grooming standards were also evolving. In earlier medieval periods, beards were often seen as marks of masculinity and wisdom. However, by the late Middle Ages, clean-shaven faces became fashionable among the upper classes. Influenced partly by Italian and French courts, hair was cut and styled with increasing attention to detail. Clothing for men became more fitted and elaborate, signaling wealth and refinement. Accessories such as gloves, hats, and jewelry were common, reflecting not only personal taste but also political alliances and social status. Underlying all these aesthetic practices was a deep entanglement with religious and moral frameworks. Beauty was never purely about pleasure or vanity. It was always framed as a reflection of inner goodness, or, conversely, spiritual danger. Sermons warned that excessive preoccupation with appearance could lead to pride, envy, and other deadly sins. Yet paradoxically, the Church also commissioned some of the most beautiful works of art and architecture, celebrating divine beauty as a path to salvation. This duality shaped the medieval imagination, creating a world where beauty was both a blessing and a burden. The intersection of beauty and gender also offers profound insights into medieval society. Women's bodies were sites of control and expression, fear and fascination. Female beauty was idealized in religious iconography, yet often policed in daily life. Men, too, were subjected to expectations about appearance, though their standards were tied more explicitly to power and honor. This dynamic created a delicate dance, where appearances were carefully managed to negotiate social roles and personal desires, as trade routes expanded and cultures interacted. Medieval beauty standards began absorbing influences from distant lands. Spices, fabrics, and cosmetics from the Middle East and Asia introduced new colors, scents, and textures to European markets. These exotic goods became symbols of sophistication and cosmopolitanism among the wealthy, further complicating notions of taste and status. The allure of the foreign blended with local traditions, producing hybrid styles that enriched the medieval aesthetic landscape in everyday life. The rituals surrounding beauty were intimately connected to communal and seasonal rhythms. Festivals, marriages, and religious ceremonies provided occasions for heightened attention to appearance. People adorned themselves with flowers, ribbons, and special garments, transforming ordinary bodies into embodiments of cultural narratives. These moments offered both celebration and escape, reinforcing social bonds while allowing brief expressions of individuality. The medical understanding of the body during this period also influenced beauty ideals. The humoral theory, which dominated medieval medicine, posited that health and temperament were governed by the balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Beauty, health, and personality were thus interlinked. A rosy complexion indicated a predominance of blood, associated with vitality and cheerfulness, while a pale or sallow face suggested imbalance and disease. Treatments aimed at restoring humoral balance included diet, bloodletting, and topical applications, all of which could affect a person's outward appearance. Throughout medieval Europe, the interplay of faith, social hierarchy, medical theory, and cultural exchange created a rich and complex tapestry of beauty standards. These standards were not static but fluid, shifting over time and across regions, shaped by forces both visible and invisible. They reflected the hopes and fears of individuals and communities, navigating a world marked by uncertainty and change. In this dynamic environment, beauty was far more than skin deep. It was a language of power and identity, a means of communication, and a field of contestation. To be beautiful was to be seen, to be judged, and to participate in the intricate dance of medieval life. Whether through the careful plucking of an eyebrow, the selection of a garment, or the subtle application of rouge, people across medieval society engaged with beauty as a vital part of their existence. As we move forward in our exploration, we will continue to uncover the stories behind these practices, the people who lived them, the meanings they carried, and the legacies they left. For in the world of medieval beauty, every gesture, every choice, tells a story about who we were, who we wished to be, and how we sought to find our place in a vast and changing world. As the Middle Ages gave way to the dawn of the Renaissance, the intricate tapestry of beauty standards woven over centuries did not unravel, but rather evolved, adopting new threads from shifting cultural, economic, and social landscapes. The medieval world's preoccupation with beauty, its desire, its fears, and its contradictions continued to ripple outward, shaping not just appearance but identity itself in ever more complex ways. Among the nobility, the ideals of beauty grew, increasingly elaborate and codified. The emergence of courts as centers of political power and cultural patronage transformed personal appearance into a form of diplomacy and spectacle. A noblewoman's beauty was as much a statement of family status as it was a personal attribute. She was expected to display refinement not only through her dress and grooming, but also through mannerisms, speech, and comportment. The etiquette manuals that began circulating during this period codified these expectations, instructing young women on how to move gracefully, maintain modest eye contact, and smile appropriately, behaviors all deeply intertwined with the performance of beauty. The garments worn by noble women became even more intricate, with layers of silk, velvet, and embroidered brocade carefully chosen to convey wealth and taste. Sleeves lengthened into flowing drapes or tight-fitting tubes, depending on fashion, and gowns were tailored to emphasize the slenderness of the waist and the gentle curve of the hips. The color palette expanded with access to richer dyes, introducing vibrant reds, deep blues, and brilliant greens that contrasted with the pale complexions so coveted at the time among men of status. The language of beauty also intensified. Doublets were embroidered with gold thread, hats adorned with feathers, and boots polished to a mirror shine. Facial hairstyles fluctuated, sometimes favoring clean-shaven faces, at other times full beards, each associated with different ideals of masculinity. The appearance of a man became a coded message of his rank, virtues, and ambitions, requiring careful negotiation in a highly hierarchical society. However, these aristocratic preoccupations did not exist in isolation. They influenced and were influenced by the broader society, trickling down to urban merchants, artisans, and even peasants, each adapting trends to their means and contexts. In burgeoning cities, markets for luxury goods such as perfumes, fine fabrics, and cosmetic products flourished, creating new opportunities for individuals to express identity and aspiration through appearance. The diffusion of printed materials, including beauty guides and fashion illustrations, further democratized access to beauty knowledge. This period also witnessed a growing fascination with the body's natural form, fueled by advances in anatomy and the rediscovery of classical texts. Artists sought to capture not only the idealized beauty of earlier centuries, but the complexities of human emotion and physicality. The works of painters like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci revealed a nuanced understanding of proportion, movement, and expression that challenged medieval conventions. Their portraits depicted subjects with imperfections, freckles, wrinkles, and asymmetry, signaling a shift toward realism and individualism in beauty standards. Religious attitudes toward beauty simultaneously evolved, becoming more accommodating of physical expression while maintaining moral boundaries. The Church continued to emphasize modesty and inner virtue, but acknowledged the beauty of God's creation in its many forms. Saints' lives and hagiographies highlighted spiritual beauty, as intertwined with physical appearance, though still within strict limits. The tension between the sacred and the secular manifested in debates over the acceptability of cosmetics, jewelry, and fashion, reflecting broader cultural shifts. Among women outside the nobility, beauty practices varied widely, shaped by regional customs, resources, and social roles. Peasant women valued practical grooming that balanced appearance with the demands of labor. Cleanliness, healthy skin, and neat hair were prized, not for vanity but as marks of respectability and vitality. Festivals and communal gatherings offered occasions for adornment and celebration, with floral wreaths, colorful ribbons, and embroidered garments enhancing natural beauty. These moments allowed for expressions of joy and identity, often suppressed in daily toil. In the realm of cosmetics, experimentation continued alongside enduring risks. While some ingredients like rosewater and almond oil were relatively safe, others carried toxic consequences. Women often relied on herbal knowledge passed through generations to create remedies for skincare, hair treatment, and fragrance. The desire to appear youthful and radiant was universal, transcending class and geography. Even as access to products varied dramatically, the intersection of beauty with health remained central in medieval thought. The humoral theory, although increasingly questioned by emerging medical science, still informed perceptions of complexion, body shape, and temperament. A balanced humoral state was equated with harmony and beauty, while imbalances signaled disease and moral failing. Physicians and apothecaries provided treatments aimed at restoring this balance, from diet and exercise to bloodletting and purgatives, influencing both appearance and well-being. Fashion and beauty were also entwined with gender performance. Men and women navigated complex codes dictating acceptable behaviors and appearances, with deviations often harshly policed. Cross-dressing was condemned, and excessive adornment by men could provoke accusations of effeminacy or moral weakness. Women's beauty was scrutinized not only for aesthetic quality, but for indications of virtue and submission. The control of women's bodies through clothing, grooming, and public behavior served as a means of maintaining patriarchal order. Nevertheless, spaces existed where these norms were challenged or reimagined. The theater, festivals, and certain urban quarters fostered environments of relative freedom, where roles could be reversed, boundaries blurred, and beauty performed as spectacle or protest. Such moments of liminality revealed the fluidity and performativity of medieval beauty standards, reminding us that they were never fixed but always contested. The importation of luxury goods from the East introduced new dimensions to medieval beauty. Silks, spices, and perfumes from the Ottoman Empire, India, and China enchanted European markets, creating desires and possibilities previously unimaginable. Exotic colors and scents became status symbols, woven into the fabric of European fashion and beauty culture. These interactions also sparked debates about purity and contamination, reflecting anxieties about the unfamiliar and the foreign. As print culture expanded, the dissemination of beauty ideals accelerated. Woodcut illustrations and printed manuals offered instructions on posture, grooming, and fashion, reaching audiences beyond the courts. These texts both reinforced existing standards and introduced new ideas, contributing to the gradual transformation of beauty into a more individualized and self-conscious practice. In parallel, the visual arts flourished, capturing the evolving ideals with unprecedented detail and sensitivity. Portraiture became a means of immortalizing not only physical likeness but social identity, aspirations, and personal narratives. The sitter's gaze, posture, and attire conveyed layers of meaning, inviting viewers to engage with beauty as a form of storytelling. The growing emphasis on individualism during the Renaissance also reshaped perceptions of beauty. physical appearance became a domain of personal expression and creativity, linked to emerging humanist philosophies that celebrated the dignity and potential of the human person. This shift laid the groundwork for modern concepts of beauty as diverse, dynamic, and deeply personal. Yet, despite these transformations, medieval legacies persisted. Many earlier notions of beauty, such as the association of paleness with purity, the moral implications of appearance, and the gendered policing of bodies, continued to influence cultural attitudes and practices for centuries. Understanding this continuity enriches our appreciation of how medieval beauty standards shaped the trajectory of Western aesthetics. As we reflect on this rich and multifaceted history, it becomes clear that medieval beauty was not a monolithic ideal, but a complex interplay of cultural meanings, social practices, and individual experiences. It was a language spoken through the body, the face, the garmenta language that conveyed power, identity, faith, and desire. Our journey through the medieval world of beauty reveals a society grappling with profound questions about selfhood, community, and the divine, all inscribed on the human form. The legacies of this era continue to echo in contemporary understandings of beauty, reminding us that appearance is always more than skin deep, is a reflection of the world we inhabit, and the histories we inherit. By the late medieval period, the pursuit and portrayal of beauty had become a complex social dance, reflecting not only personal desires but also the shifting tides of political power, religious doctrine, and economic transformation. In the bustling towns and courts of Europe, beauty was both a tool and a battleground, a way to assert status, secure alliances, and navigate the intricate hierarchies that defined medieval life. One of the most striking features of this era was the role of cosmetics and grooming rituals, which, despite official church condemnation, flourished in private and public spheres alike. The use of makeup was a carefully guarded secret, passed among women in whispers and through discreet correspondence. Pale skin, a coveted trait signifying noble birth and freedom from labor, was achieved through dangerous means, including the application of white lead and vinegar. While these substances promised a flawless complexion, their toxicity often led to disfigurement or even death, underscoring the extreme lengths to which individuals would go to conform to beauty ideals. Lip and cheek color were similarly manipulated using natural pigments derived from berries, minerals, or synthetic compounds. The bright flush of rouge was associated with health and vitality, offering a stark contrast to the prevailing ideal of paleness. Eye makeup, such as kohl or soot, was applied to darkened eyelashes and enhanced the eyes, creating a dramatic and alluring effect. Though these practices were sometimes dismissed as vanity or deceit, they represented a form of agency and self-expression within restrictive social frameworks. Hair, too, played a crucial role in medieval beauty standards. The shape and style of hair indicated social status, marital condition, and even moral character. Women's hair was often tightly bound beneath veils or elaborate headdresses, serving both to conform to modesty codes and to display wealth through intricate ornamentation. The high forehead ideal, achieved by plucking or shaving the hairline, was popular among noble women, symbolizing intelligence and refinement. Men's hairstyles ranged from long and flowing to closely cropped, with beards waxing and waning in fashion as markers of masculinity and piety. Clothing served as one of the most visible and enforceable expressions of beauty and social order. Sumptuary laws regulated the use of materials, colors, and embellishments, aiming to maintain clear distinctions between classes. Silk, velvet, and brocade were reserved for the elite, while wool and linen were worn by commoners. However, these laws were often circumvented or creatively interpreted, as individuals sought to assert identity and aspiration through fashion. The expanding trade networks brought exotic fabrics and dyes from the East, introducing new textures and hues that enriched European wardrobes. The interplay between religion and beauty was fraught with tension. While the Church exalted spiritual purity and humility, it also celebrated the beauty of creation and the human form as a reflection of divine glory. This paradox was evident in religious art, where saints and biblical figures were portrayed, with idealized features, yet imbued with human emotion and imperfection. Religious festivals offered opportunities for elaborate dress and adornment. Blending sacred ritual with communal celebration, women's beauty was particularly scrutinized and regulated, reflecting broader societal efforts to control female bodies and behavior. Modesty was paramount, with strict codes governing dress, speech, and conduct. Yet, within these constraints, women found ways to assert individuality and power through subtle variations in appearance and demeanor. Courtly love literature and art celebrated female beauty as an object of desire and inspiration, while simultaneously reinforcing ideals of chastity and submission. Men's appearances were equally significant in negotiating social roles. Military attire, grooming, and fashion conveyed messages of strength, honor, and political allegiance. The emergence of portraiture as a genre allowed men to project images of authority and refinement, blending realism with idealization. The cultivation of personal appearance became a vital aspect of court life and diplomacy. Across social strata, festivals, markets, and public gatherings provided occasions for heightened attention to beauty and fashion. These events were stages for display and competition, where individuals could challenge or reinforce social norms. The performative aspects of beauty became intertwined with communal identity and cultural expression. Medical theories continued to influence perceptions of beauty and health. The humoral system linked complexion and temperament, guiding treatments and grooming practices. The concept of balance extended beyond the body to social and moral realms, reinforcing the idea that beauty was a reflection of harmony within and without. The influx of luxury goods from Asia and the Middle East not only transformed fashion but also introduced new cultural ideas and aesthetics. Perfumes, dyes, and textiles became symbols of cosmopolitanism and sophistication, while also sparking anxieties about purity and influence. The cross-cultural exchanges enriched European beauty standards, contributing to their diversity and complexity. As print technology advanced, the dissemination of beauty advice, fashion trends, and etiquette manuals expanded the reach of cultural norms. These texts played a role in standardizing ideals, while also inspiring individual experimentation. The visual arts flourished, capturing the nuanced interplay of appearance, personality, and status, with unprecedented depth. The late medieval period, set the stage for the Renaissance's more dramatic reimagining of beauty, characterized by a celebration of individuality, naturalism, and human potential. Yet, the enduring legacies of medieval aesthetics continued to shape cultural attitudes, revealing the intricate layering of history in our contemporary understandings of beauty. The transformation of beauty standards from the medieval period into the early Renaissance was neither swift nor uniform. Instead, it was a gradual, multifaceted evolution shaped by cultural exchanges, technological advances, and shifting social structures. As medieval society approached its twilight, the ideals of beauty became increasingly intertwined with notions of individual identity and expression, setting the stage for profound changes that would resonate through the centuries. One of the most significant drivers of this change was the growing accessibility of art and literature that celebrated the human form in more naturalistic and individualized ways. The proliferation of portraiture, for example, was more than mere vanity. It represented a burgeoning awareness of personal legacy and selfhood. Patrons commissioned artists not only to capture physical likeness but to project qualities such as intelligence, virtue, and status. These portraits served as visual affirmations of identity, embedding beauty within a larger narrative of human experience. The role of women in this evolving landscape was especially complex. While medieval beauty standards often confined women to narrow ideals of purity and submissiveness, the early Renaissance began to reveal new possibilities. Women of wealth and influence exercised agency through patronage, education, and subtle manipulation of appearance. They commissioned portraits, curated wardrobes, and engaged in intellectual circles, crafting identities that transcended traditional boundaries. Cosmetics and grooming continued to play a vital role, but with evolving attitudes. Though the Church's moral stance against vanity persisted, the growing interest in personal care reflected broader social changes. Herbal remedies and early forms of skincare became more sophisticated, blending folk knowledge with emerging scientific inquiry. The use of cosmetics, once clandestine, became more openly discussed in certain circles, signaling a shift in cultural acceptance. Men's beauty standards also evolved in tandem with shifting ideals of masculinity. The emphasis on physical strength and martial prowess remained, but new traits such as education, eloquence, and artistic patronage gained prominence. The appearance of men in fashion reflected this balance, combining elements of traditional masculinity with refined elegance. Hairstyles, clothing, and grooming practices adapted accordingly, creating a nuanced portrait of early modern manhood. Fashion itself became a powerful medium of social negotiation. The rise of merchant classes and urban centers created new opportunities for display and aspiration. Sumptuary laws, though still enforced, became increasingly difficult to regulate in the face of growing demand for luxury goods and personal expression. Clothing and accessories were employed strategically to signal allegiance, ambition, and identity across diverse social milieus. Religious influences, while still deeply embedded in cultural norms, began to accommodate more complex understandings of beauty and the body. The humanist movement, with its emphasis on classical learning and the dignity of the individual, fostered a renewed appreciation for human form and experience. Religious art reflected this shift, portraying sacred figures with emotional depth and human vulnerability. The spread of printing technology accelerated these cultural transformations. Manuals on etiquette, fashion, and personal care reached wider audiences, democratizing knowledge and shaping tastes. Illustrations and treatises offered guidance on posture, grooming, and social conduct, intertwining beauty with behavior and morality. These texts reveal the increasing self-consciousness of individuals, navigating evolving social landscapes. Medical theories continued to influence beauty practices, though advances in anatomy and physiology began to challenge earlier paradigms. The humoral system remained prevalent, but new discoveries prompted reconsiderations of health, complexion, and temperament. These shifts affected both treatment methods and aesthetic preferences, illustrating the interconnectedness of science and culture. Cross-cultural interactions expanded through trade, travel, and diplomacy, introducing European societies to diverse beauty ideals and practices. Textiles, perfumes, and cosmetics from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa enriched European palates and concepts of allure. These exchanges fostered both fascination and apprehension, reflecting complex dynamics of admiration, appropriation, and resistance. The late medieval period also witnessed increased regulation of beauty and behavior, particularly regarding gender and sexuality. Social norms and legal codes sought to control expressions of identity that threatened established hierarchies. Nonetheless, spaces of resistance and creativity emerged, including theatrical performances, festivals, and informal gatherings where conventional standards could be challenged or inverted. In everyday life, beauty remained deeply connected to communal and religious rituals. Weddings, funerals, and holy days provided occasions for elaborate adornment and display, reinforcing social cohesion while allowing moments of individual expression. These practices illustrate the ongoing negotiation between collective identity and personal desire. As the medieval era gave way to the Renaissance, the legacy of medieval beauty standards persisted, even as new ideals took root. The tension between conformity and individuality, morality and desire, public and private, continued to shape perceptions and practices. Understanding this dynamic offers valuable insight into the historical foundations of contemporary beauty culture. Ultimately, the medieval pursuit of beauty was a reflection of humanity's enduring quest to understand and express the self within the constraints of society and faith. It reveals a world rich in complexity, contradiction, and creativity, a world where beauty was not simply an aesthetic choice but a vital language of power, identity, and meaning. Delving deeper into the intimate and often unseen realms of medieval beauty reveals how profoundly personal yet widely social these standards were. The rituals of grooming and adornment, those daily acts of care or transformation, were steeped in symbolism and meaning, reflecting not only individual desires but the collective values of a society that balanced faith, tradition, and emerging self-awareness. Central to the medieval conception of beauty was the notion of harmony between body and spirit, between nature and culture. The body was not merely flesh and bone, but a vessel of moral and spiritual significance. To maintain beauty was to maintain balance, an idea rooted deeply in religious teachings and medical philosophies of the time. This philosophy meant that The external presentation of the self was inseparable from the internal condition of the soul. In practice, this translated into a complex regimen of physical care. Bathing, for example, was more than cleanliness. It was a spiritual purification. While popular myths depict the medieval era as unhygienic, historical records suggest that public baths and personal hygiene practices were relatively common, especially in urban centers and among the elite. These baths were often scented with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, which not only masked odors but were believed to have healing properties. The ritual of bathing thus combined practical cleanliness with symbolic renewal. Skincare was a particular focus of beauty rituals. Smooth, pale skin was prized, symbolizing not just health but social status and moral purity. Various concoctions, from simple herbal infusions to complex mixtures involving lead and mercury, were applied to achieve this effect. The dangers of such substances were often overlooked or misunderstood, underscoring the desperation and determination behind these beauty practices. Women, in particular, engaged in these treatments, sometimes guided by midwives, apothecaries, or family traditions. Hair care held equally significant cultural weight. The elaborate hairstyles and coverings worn by women were both aesthetic and social signals. Hair was a potent symbol of femininity and virtue, and its management was governed by intricate customs. The process of plucking the hairline to create the high forehead ideal, while painful, was a testament to the lengths women would go to embody the prevailing standards of grace and intelligence. The use of scented oils and combs, the weaving of ribbons or pearls into braids, all contributed to a visual language of beauty. Men's grooming, too, carried social meaning. The shift from long beards to clean-shaven faces among the nobility marked changes in conceptions of masculinity and decorum. Beard styles became a form of self-expression and political statement. The meticulous care of hair and nails was also a marker of refinement, distinguishing the gentleman from the laborer. Clothing functioned as an extension of these beauty ideals, its materials and styles reflecting not only fashion but also identity and social order. The length of a man's hose, the cut of a woman's gown, the embroidery on a collarol conveyed information about class, wealth, and virtue. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate these signals, preserving hierarchies by restricting access to certain fabrics and colors. However, these laws were often contested or circumvented, revealing the persistent desire for self-fashioning and social mobility. Perfumes and scents played an understated yet vital role in medieval beauty culture. The sense of smell was closely linked to spiritual and physical well-being. Fragrances made from rosewater, ambergris, musk, and spices were applied to the body and clothing, creating an aura of refinement. These scents also masked the less pleasant odors of daily life, especially in crowded urban environments. The trade in exotic spices and aromatic substances fueled not only economic exchange but also cultural imagination. The interplay of beauty and morality was nowhere more evident than in religious attitudes toward the body. The Church's teachings emphasized humility and the dangers of vanity, yet simultaneously celebrated the human form as a reflection of divine creation. This paradox created a moral landscape in which beauty was both a gift and a temptation. Religious art and literature often depicted this tension, portraying figures whose physical beauty was intertwined with spiritual virtue or peril. Women's bodies, in particular, were sites of both reverence and control. Beauty was expected to align with chastity, modesty, and obedience, and deviations could lead to suspicion or condemnation. Yet, within these strictures, women found ways to assert agency through the careful management of their appearance. The act of dressing, grooming, and adorning became a form of communication, negotiating power within the constraints of patriarchy. Men's appearances were similarly governed by social expectations, but with different emphases. Physical strength, honor, and lineage were paramount, but so were education and cultural sophistication. Fashion and grooming were tools to project these qualities, and men's beauty was often intertwined with their roles as warriors, courtiers, or patrons of the arts. The cultural significance of beauty extended beyond individual bodies to encompass community and identity. Festivals, weddings, and religious ceremonies provided occasions for collective expressions of beauty, reinforcing social bonds and shared values. The adornment of spaces, objects, and bodies during these events created immersive environments where beauty and meaning were inseparable. Medical knowledge shaped not only treatments but also perceptions of beauty and health. The humoral theory, despite its limitations, offered a framework for understanding complexion, temperament, and bodily functions. This theory influenced diet, exercise, and grooming practices, linking the maintenance of beauty to overall well-being. Encounters introduced new dimensions to medieval beauty standards. Trade routes brought not only goods but ideas, styles, and materials from distant lands. The incorporation of these influences enriched European aesthetics, challenging and expanding traditional norms. At the same time, these exchanges generated anxieties about purity, identity, and cultural boundaries. The rise of print culture facilitated the spread of beauty knowledge, etiquette, and fashion trends. Manuals and illustrated guides reached broader audiences, shaping practices and expectations. This democratization of beauty information reflected broader social changes, including increased literacy and the growth of urban centers. Throughout this period, the performance of beauty was a dynamic and contested practice, shaped by forces of tradition, innovation, power, and resistance. It was a language through which individuals expressed identity, navigated social hierarchies, and engaged with cultural meanings. Understanding medieval beauty standards thus requires an appreciation of their complexity and context. They were not merely superficial or prescriptive, but deeply embedded in the social, religious, and cultural fabric of the time. The legacy of these standards continues to inform contemporary notions of beauty, identity, and self-expression. As we journey further into the labyrinth of medieval aesthetics, it becomes clear that beauty standards were inseparable from the broader currents of power, faith, and cultural exchange. The ways people presented themselves through dress, grooming, and demeanor were not merely personal choices, but statements loaded with meaning and consequence. These outward expressions served as markers of social identity, moral standing, and even political allegiance, embedding beauty within the very fabric of medieval life. Central to medieval beauty ideals was the pervasive influence of religion. The Christian worldview permeated every aspect of life, including conceptions of the body and appearance. The human form was considered a divine creation, a temple of the soul, yet also a source of temptation and sin. This duality shaped attitudes toward beauty. It was both a blessing to be nurtured and a potential snare to be wary of. The Church's teachings encouraged modesty, humility, and the cultivation of inner virtue over outward show. Yet, paradoxically, religious institutions commissioned some of the most beautiful art and architecture of the era. Celebrating the divine through aesthetic splendor, the embodiment of these ideals was often reflected in the clothing and grooming practices of the nobility. Sumptuary laws governed what materials and styles could be worn by different classes, reinforcing social hierarchies and moral codes. Rich fabrics such as silk, velvet, and brocade were reserved for the aristocracy, dyed in vibrant colors that symbolized power and status. The complexity of garments, with layers, embroidery, and jewelry, transformed the body into a living canvas of wealth and influence. Hairstyles were equally significant. For women, the ideal of a high forehead achieved by plucking or shaving. The hairline signified intelligence and refinement, while veils and elaborate headdresses communicated marital status and modesty. Men's grooming styles varied over time, reflecting changing ideals of masculinity. Beards could symbolize wisdom and authority, or be seen as uncivilized, depending on the cultural context and period. Clean-shaven faces gained popularity in later medieval Europe, aligning with emerging notions of courtly elegance. Cosmetics and skin treatments, though officially condemned by religious authorities as vain or sinful, were widely used, often in secret. Pale skin was prized as a mark of nobility and purity, achieved through powders containing harmful substances such as white lead. Rouge and lip color added vibrancy, while kohl accentuated the eyes. These beauty practices were acts of both conformity and resistance, navigating the tension between social expectations and personal desire. The medical understanding of the body during the medieval period played a crucial role in shaping beauty standards. The humoral theory, which posited that health and temperament depended on the balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, informed ideas about complexion and personality. A rosy complexion was associated with vitality and sanguine temperament, while pallor indicated chastity or illness, depending on context. Treatments aimed at balancing the humors included diet, exercise, and topical applications, linking physical appearance to holistic well-being. Gender norms profoundly influenced beauty ideals. Women's appearance was closely regulated, reflecting broader societal efforts to control female sexuality and behavior. Modesty, chastity, and obedience were emphasized, with clothing and grooming serving as tools of social control. Yet within these constraints, women exercised agency, using fashion and cosmetics to assert identity, status, and even subtle forms of power. Men's beauty standards were tied to ideals of strength, honor, and leadership, with appearance serving as a performance of these qualities. The cultural landscape was further enriched by the exchange of goods, ideas, and aesthetics through expanding trade networks. Luxury fabrics, spices, perfumes, and cosmetics from the East and North Africa introduced new dimensions to European beauty practices. These imports became symbols of sophistication and cosmopolitanism, while also provoking anxieties. about cultural purity and influence. The interaction of local traditions with foreign elements created hybrid styles and practices. Reflecting the dynamic nature of medieval culture, public events, festivals, and ceremonies provided arenas for the performance and negotiation of beauty. Standards, weddings, religious feasts, and civic celebrations featured elaborate dress, music, and dance, transforming individuals and communities into living embodiments of cultural ideals. These occasions reinforced social hierarchies while also allowing moments of creativity and transgression. Art and literature of the period reveal the nuances and contradictions of medieval beauty. From illuminated manuscripts to tapestries and sculptures, representations of beauty conveyed moral lessons, social ideals, and human emotions. Literature, including courtly love poetry and religious texts, explored themes of desire, virtue, and appearance, reflecting and shaping contemporary attitudes. The gradual rise of humanism and the Renaissance ushered in new perspectives on beauty, emphasizing individualism, naturalism, and the celebration of the human body. However, these shifts built upon medieval foundations, demonstrating the continuity and transformation of beauty ideals over time. In exploring medieval beauty standards, we uncover a world where appearance was a language rich with meaning, one that communicated identity, faith, power, and aspiration. These standards were not static edicts but lived experiences, negotiated daily by individuals within the complex social fabric of their time. Understanding this history deepens our appreciation for the ways beauty continues to function in society, revealing its enduring role as a mirror of human values and a medium of cultural expression. The social fabric of medieval Europe was intricately woven with threads of appearance and identity, where beauty was not a mere aesthetic pursuit, but a powerful tool for navigating a world defined by rigid hierarchies and evolving cultural norms. To comprehend the full scope of medieval beauty standards, it is essential to explore how they intersected with the dynamics of class, gender, religion, and even economics. In the stratified society of the Middle Ages, beauty was often a visual language of power and privilege. The clothing worn by the aristocracy was lavish and symbolic, sumptuous velvets, shimmering silks, and intricate embroidery served as outward manifestations of inner worth and social rank. Yet, these sartorial choices were bound by strict regulations. Sumptuary laws aimed to preserve the social order by restricting who could wear certain colors or fabrics. For example, purple associated with royalty and divinity was reserved for monarchs and high-ranking clergy, while commoners were confined to more modest materials like wool and linen. Despite these laws, fashion remained a fluid and contested space where individuals negotiated identity and aspiration. Among women, beauty was a complex and multifaceted ideal that combined physical appearance with behavior and virtue. A pale complexion signified not only nobility but also chastity and purity, ideals fiercely guarded in a patriarchal society. To achieve this, noble women often resorted to cosmetic applications containing hazardous substances such as white lead. Hair, a potent symbol of femininity, was carefully managed. The high forehead ideal involved plucking or shaving hairlines, a painful but esteemed practice. Hairstyles and head coverings communicated marital status and social propriety, with married women typically veiling their hair as a sign of modesty. men's beauty ideals, while also tied to social status, emphasized strength, honor, and decorum. The styles of facial hair fluctuated, with beards often associated with wisdom and maturity, though clean-shaven looks gained favor in certain courts for their association with refinement. Clothing for men became increasingly tailored and elaborate, incorporating fashionable doublets, hose, and ornate accessories that signified wealth and political alliances. Grooming practices were as much about projecting authority as personal hygiene. Religious doctrine exerted a profound influence on medieval beauty standards. The Church preached humility and warned against vanity, viewing excessive concern with appearance as a potential sin leading the soul astray. Yet paradoxically, religious institutions also celebrated beauty as a reflection of divine order. This duality was expressed vividly in religious art, where saints and holy figures were idealized with radiant skin and serene expressions, embodying spiritual purity. Festivals and religious ceremonies offered occasions for communal display, where participants adorned themselves in ways that honored both God and community traditions. Medical theories such as the humoral system shaped perceptions of health and beauty. The balance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was thought to influence complexion, temperament, and physical appearance. A rosy, sanguine complexion was prized as a sign of health and vitality, while deviations, such as pallor or sallowness, could indicate illness or moral failing. Treatments to restore humoral balance often involved diets, herbal remedies, and cosmetic applications. Linking inner health with outer beauty, economic factors also played a critical role. The rise of towns and a merchant class created new opportunities for the display of wealth through fashion and personal care. Access to luxury fabrics, spices, and cosmetics expanded beyond the aristocracy, allowing broader segments of society to engage in beauty practices. However, these opportunities were still mediated by social norms and legal restrictions. Cultural exchanges along trade routes introduced new materials, scents, and styles to European beauty practices. The importation of silk from Asia, exotic perfumes from the Middle East, and spices from Africa enriched the sensory palette of medieval Europe. These goods were not only luxury items, but also carriers of cultural meaning, symbolizing sophistication and worldly knowledge. At the same time, the unfamiliar origins of these products sparked anxieties about purity and cultural identity, reflecting complex attitudes toward the foreign and exotic. The theatrical and festive life of medieval communities provided spaces where beauty standards could be both reinforced and subverted. Masquerades, carnivals, and religious pageants allowed participants to experiment with appearance and roles, challenging everyday norms. These liminal moments revealed the performative nature of beauty and its capacity to both uphold and question. Social order. Advances in art and literature during the late medieval period further reflected and shaped beauty ideals. Portraiture gained prominence, capturing not just physical likeness, but character and status. Literary works explored themes of love, virtue, and desire, often intertwining beauty with moral and spiritual lessons. The visual and textual arts served as mirrors and molders of societal values as the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance. The foundations laid by these centuries of complex beauty practices persisted, even as new ideas and aesthetics emerged. The increasing emphasis on individuality, realism, and human potential in Renaissance art and thought built upon the medieval legacy, illustrating the continuity and transformation of cultural ideals by examining medieval beauty standards in their full social, religious, and cultural context. We gain a richer understanding of how appearance functioned as a vital site of meaning and power. Beauty was never merely superficial. It was deeply woven into the identities and lives of medieval people, shaping and reflecting their world in profound ways. As the twilight of the medieval period approached, beauty standards stood at a crossroads, shaped by centuries of tradition, even as they faced the winds of change brought by emerging humanism, expanding trade, and shifting political landscapes. The era's fascination with appearance was not merely about aesthetics, but woven tightly into the social, spiritual, and psychological fabric of life, illustrating the enduring complexity of human identity and expression. In the noble courts of Europe, appearance remained a critical instrument of power. The carefully constructed garments of silk and brocade, painstakingly embroidered and adorned with jewels, were not simply decorative but declarations of influence and prestige. These visual displays communicated alliances, ambitions, and hierarchies with unspoken clarity. Yet, beneath the layers of fabric and finery, the maintenance of beauty involved rituals that were both intimate and demanding. Cosmetics, often dangerous concoctions, were applied to achieve the luminous, pale complexion emblematic of noble status. The pursuit of such ideals, despite the health risks, reflected the high stakes involved in social positioning. Men's fashion and grooming were equally significant in expressing authority and identity. Hairstyles fluctuated with prevailing trends, from flowing locks symbolizing romantic valor to closely cropped cuts emphasizing discipline and control. Facial hair was a potent symbol, with beards or clean shaves marking different facets of masculinity, piety, or courtly fashion. Beyond mere appearance, these choices aligned men with political factions and cultural ideals, underscoring the performative nature of beauty. Religious and moral discourses continued to exert influence, often in tension with worldly desires for adornment and elegance. The Church's emphasis on humility and the dangers of vanity contrasted with the undeniable human urge for self-expression and social display. This paradox found expression in religious festivals, where beauty and devotion intertwined. Participants adorned themselves in vibrant colors and symbolic garments, transforming communal worship into a spectacle of shared identity and spiritual aspiration. The health and medical theories of the time, though limited by contemporary knowledge, shaped beauty practices in meaningful ways. The humoral theory linked bodily balance to appearance and temperament, reinforcing the belief that external beauty was a reflection of inner harmony. Treatments designed to restore this balance through diet, exercise, or medicinal applications highlighted the holistic understanding of health and aesthetics. The association of beauty with moral and physical well-being underscored the era's integrated worldview. Women's beauty remained a focal point of societal regulation and personal negotiation. The ideal of modesty coexisted uneasily with the desire for adornment and attraction. Marital status, virtue, and social role were communicated through dress, grooming, and behavior. Women used these tools to navigate constraints, assert presence, and sometimes wield subtle influence within patriarchal structures. The high forehead, the veil, the carefully styled herald were elements in this complex language of identity. Among the broader population, evolving economic conditions and urban growth expanded access to beauty practices and luxury goods. Merchants and artisans adopted fashion trends and grooming rituals to signify upward mobility and cultural engagement. However, sumptuary laws continued to police these expressions, reflecting tensions between aspiration and tradition. Cultural exchange played an increasingly important role in shaping beauty ideals. Exotic textiles, perfumes, and cosmetics from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa enriched European tastes and practices. These imports were not only markers of wealth, but carriers of cultural meanings that both fascinated and unsettled local populations. The blending of foreign influences with native customs produced dynamic and hybrid aesthetics. Public ceremonies, theatrical performances, and festivals provided spaces where conventional beauty norms were enacted, challenged, and reimagined. These events underscored the performative and communal dimensions of appearance, revealing beauty as a living and contested cultural practice. The arts, painting, sculpture, literature continued to evolve, reflecting changing conceptions of beauty. Portraiture captured not just likeness, but personality, status, and aspiration, contributing to the growing emphasis on individuality. Literary works explored the tensions between physical allure and moral virtue, illuminating the complex interplay of desire, identity, and ethics. As the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance, the seeds of modern beauty culture were sown. Yet, the legacies of medieval standards, its ideals, anxieties, and practices persisted, woven into the ongoing narrative of human self-fashioning. In reflecting on medieval beauty standards, we recognize a world where appearance was deeply meaningful, where every detail of dress, grooming, and comportment carried weight and significance. This exploration enriches our understanding of how beauty functions as both personal expression and social language, transcending time to connect us with the past. As we arrive at the closing chapter of our journey through medieval beauty standards, it is essential to reflect not only on the specific practices and ideals that shaped appearance in this fascinating era, but also on the broader implications of these standards for identity, culture, and history. The medieval obsession with beauty, in all its complexity and contradiction, offers profound insight into the human condition and the ways societies construct meaning through the body. Throughout the Middle Ages, beauty was never simply an individual pursuit of attractiveness. It was a social currency, a spiritual symbol, and a political statement. It was a language spoken fluently across the tapestry of medieval life, from the royal courts, adorned with sumptuous silks and jewels, to the bustling market squares where artisans and peasants expressed pride and aspiration through dress and grooming. Beauty marked boundaries of class, gender, and morality, while also serving as a site of negotiation, resistance, and creativity. The pursuit of a pale, flawless complexion among the nobility reflected not just a preference for physical traits, but a deeper social stratification. Paleness symbolized exemption from labor and proximity to divine grace. The risks taken to achieve such beauty, using toxic cosmetics and arduous grooming rituals, underscore the immense value placed on appearance as a marker of status and virtue. Likewise, the regulation of clothing through sumptuary laws reveals how tightly beauty was controlled to maintain social order, even as individuals continually pushed the boundaries through fashion and adornment. Gendered expectations around beauty exposed the tensions inherent in medieval society's views on the body and identity. Women's appearances were policed in service of chastity and modesty. Yet women themselves engaged in sophisticated practices of self-presentation that allowed for agency within constraint. Men's grooming and fashion expressed ideals of power, honor, and refinement, shaped by shifting cultural and political landscapes. Religious doctrines infused beauty with spiritual significance, framing the body as both a sacred vessel and a site of potential sin. This duality created a moral framework within which beauty was both celebrated and feared, leading to a rich cultural dialogue expressed in art, literature, and ritual. The interplay of humility and display was a defining feature of medieval aesthetics. The influence of medical theory on beauty practices highlights the medieval holistic worldview, where health, temperament, and appearance were interconnected. Treatments aimed at humoral balance reveal a sophisticated, if flawed, attempt to understand and care for the body, blending science, tradition, and cultural belief. Trade and cultural exchange expanded the horizons of medieval beauty, introducing exotic materials, scents, and ideas that enriched European aesthetics and provoked questions of identity and purity. These interactions remind us that medieval Europe was not isolated but part of a vibrant, interconnected world. Public festivities and theatrical performances provided spaces for the enactment and contestation of beauty norms, revealing the performative nature of appearance and its role in community life. The arts, from illuminated manuscripts to portraiture and poetry, captured and shaped evolving ideals, bridging the sacred and the secular. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, the foundations laid during these centuries continued to influence concepts of beauty, identity, and culture. The legacy of medieval beauty standards is visible in modern aesthetics, social practices, and the enduring human fascination with appearance. In concluding this exploration, we recognize that beauty in the medieval world was far more than skin deep. It was a multifaceted expression of humanity's deepest values, fears, and aspirations, a mirror reflecting the complexities of a society negotiating faith, power, and selfhood. This rich history invites us to reconsider contemporary beauty ideals, reminding us of their historical roots and cultural significance. Thank you for joining this immersive journey into the enigmatic and compelling world of medieval beauty standards. May it deepen your understanding of how the past continues to shape the present, and how the pursuit of beauty remains a profound human endeavor across time.